Okay. Alright, I'm Unseen Warfare. We're back. How's everybody doing? Um Plan on reading from this paper here, The Royal Path, True Orthodoxy in an Age of Apostasy. So that should be interesting, and hope everybody is well. So it says at the top of the page, it says, "For it is a commandment of the Lord not to be silent at a time when the faith is in jeopardy. Speak, Scripture says, and hold not thy peace. For this reason, I, the wretched one, fearing the tribunal, also speak." St. Theodore the Studite. Okay. So it says, in memory of Hiram Seraphim Rose, on the 27th anniversary of his holy repose, August 20th, 1982, Old Style, The Royal Path, True Orthodoxy in the Age of Apostasy. Hiram Seraphim Eugene Rose in the world was born in 1934 of Protestant parents in California. He studied at Pomona College in Los Angeles and received an MA from the University of California at Berkeley. Philosophical by nature and thirsting for the truth, after a long and wandering search, he discovered it in Holy Orthodoxy, which he eagerly embraced in 1961, literally dedicating himself to it. His profound study of works of the great Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky contributed to this, as did the friendship and bond that he formed with Gleb Podomoshinsky, then a student at the Holy Trinity Orthodox Theological Seminary in Jordanville, New York, and subsequently his fellow ascetic Father Herman. In 1963, they founded the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood for the purpose of missionary work. In 1965, with the blessing of their spiritual father, the Most Holy Archbishop John Maximovich of San Francisco, 1966, they began publication of the well-known periodical, The Orthodox Word. Publishing this periodical was a veritable feat when we bear in mind that up until 1981, it was typeset manually and printed on a hand-operated press. In 1969, they founded the monastery of St. Herman of Alaska and Platina in the wilderness region in Northern California, and in 1970, they received the monastic schema. Father Seraphim was given a blessing to live in a small hut where he followed a very strict ascetical regimen, praying, studying, and writing until 1977, when he was ordained a priest by the virtuous Bishop Nectary of Seattle of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. 1983, a disciple of the renowned last elder of Optina, Saint Nectary, 1928. Thereafter, he worked more in a missionary capacity until his holy repose on August 20th, 1982, Old Style, at the age of only 48. Father Seraphim harmoniously combined in his person asceticism, astonishing in our days, with freedom from anger, meekness, humility, silence, unceasing prayer, profound love, and spiritual discretion. Recently, a monastic from Serbia has written, "The Athonite Hesychus, an instructor of the prayer of the heart, Bishop Anophelicius, I don't know how to say that right, once said that Father Seraphim was granted the greatest gift that a man can be granted on earth, the gift of spiritual discernment. He is particularly distinguished from his gift of eloquence and wisdom, as attested both by those who knew him and by his numerous writings, a large part of which remains still unpublished. In these writings we find not only his profound education and his wealth of knowledge, but also the ever living and flourishing spirit and grace of our God bearing fathers, the mind of Christ, and a strong. Oh, wait. You guys aren't following along, are you guys? because I don't have it on the. Hold on. Let's see if that worked. Oh, here we are. Okay, so it says he was particularly distinguished for his gift of eloquence and wisdom, as attested both by those who knew him and by his numerous writings, a large part which remain still unpublished. In these writings, quote, we find not only his profound education and his wealth of knowledge, but also the ever living and flourishing spirit of grace of our God, bearing fathers, the mind of Christ, and a strong Nicias towards a life that is lofty and fully consecrated to our life giving Savior, the apocalyptic and prophetic dimension of our holy faith. His knowledge of many languages, and especially his deep knowledge of Russian, impelled him to produce a multitude of very noteworthy translations in order to make the treasures of the Fathers known in the New World. Quote, in his short life, Father Seraphim offered himself for the glory of God and the salvation of his fellow men. His preaching ministry helped many people to find the way to orthodoxy and their salvation, while his literary activity included hundreds of articles and dozens of books that bear witness to his anxiety to preserve and transmit genuine traditional orthodoxy. It was precisely this anxiety, coupled with his healthy and pure zeal, that prompted him to write the following article, among others, his love for the true faith, which he expresses in this article. And at the same, let's see, uh, time, his anguish and distress over the indiscernible trend among traditionalist Orthodox in America, Greece, and elsewhere, towards inordinate zeal marked by extremist tendencies with very grievous consequences at uh, ecclesiological and at a practical level, is set forth with clarity, candor, and profundity. The timeliness of this article remains undiminished, even though almost 30 years have elapsed since it was written in 1976. If the sacred struggle for the faith is to succeed, it must be conducted, quote, properly and, quote, lawfully. The most important thing is to protect and preserve the faith from the insidious pollution of heresy and to witness uh, to it in a patristic, traditional, and orthodox spirit. The message of Orthodox resistance on the part of those who abide by the traditions of the Fathers must not be sullied by the injudicious activities and unsound ideas. Excuse me. Whoa, okay. All right. So where are we at? So unsound ideas. The path of moderation, the royal path, which the late Father Seraphim chose and which he consistently followed in matters of faith, did not please everyone. Many who belonged to, quote, official Orthodox churches enmeshed in the ecumenical movement considered him a dangerous fanatic. Although they admired his spiritual greatness and praised his otherwise indisputable contribution to orthodoxy, others, indistinguished by their zeal, quote, quote, zeal not according to knowledge, denounced him as a betrayer of orthodoxy. Such has always been the lot of those who follow the royal path of moderation and discretion. Let the present article be considered a very small tribute to the memory of late Father Seraphim, this year being the 25th anniversary of his holy repose. Let his holy and discerning zeal be a shining example for us, and let his holy prayers guide us on the quote royal path. Okay, so what is happening with this? Okay, here we go. All right. Starts off here: true orthodoxy in the age of apostasy. Quote: as the fathers say, the extremes from both sides are equally harmful. We must go on the royal path, avoiding both extremes on both sides. The extremes on both sides. 1. The devil strives to convert the body of Christ into a quote ecumenical organization. Orthodox Christians live today in one of the great critical times in the history of Christ's church. The enemy of man's salvation, the devil, attacks on all fronts and strives by all means not merely to divert believers from the path of salvation known by the church, but even to conquer the church of Christ itself. Despite the Savior's promise, somebody's like doing some construction work or something right now, so this is probably the worst time to do a reading, but it is what it is. So, of course, we know this that the Savior's promise and to convert the very body of Christ into a quote ecumenical organization, preparing for the coming of his own chosen one, Antichrist, the great world ruler of the last days. Of course, we know that this attempt of Satan will fail. The church will be the bride of Christ even to the end of the world, and will meet Christ, the bridegroom, at his second coming, pure and undefiled by adulterous union with the apostasy of this age. But the great question of our times for all Orthodox Christians to face is the moment is a momentous one. I don't know how to say that. The church will remain, but how many of us will still be in it, having withstood the devil's mighty attempts to draw us away from it? Our times are even worse and more dangerous than those of St. Mark of Ephesus. Our times are much like those of St. Mark of Ephesus in the 15th century, when it seemed that the church was about to be dissolved into impious union with the Latins. Nay, our times are even worse and more dangerous than those times, for then the union was an act imposed by the force from without, while now the Orthodox people have been long prepared for the approaching, quote, ecumenical merger of all churches and religions by decades of laxness, indifference, worldliness, and indulgence, and the ruinous falsehood that, quote, nothing really separates us from all others who call themselves Christians. The Orthodox Church survived the false union of Florence and even knew a time of outward prosperity and inward flourishing after that. But after the new false union now being pursued with ever increasing momentum, will Orthodoxy exist save it all in the catacombs and the deserts? During the past 10 years and more, under the disastrous quote ecumenical course pursued by Patriarch Athenagoras and his successor, the Orthodox churches have already come perilously close to total shipwreck. The newest quote ecumenical statement of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the quote Thyatira Confession, is already sufficient evidence of how far the Orthodox conscience has been lost by the local churches that once was among the Orthodox churches in the Confession of Christ's truth. This dismal document only shows how close the hierarchs of Constantinople have now come to being absorbed into the heterodox Christianity of the West, quote, Christianity of the West. and even before the formal union which is still being prepared. 3. The roots of ecumenism. The roots of today's ecumenism in the Orthodox churches goes back to the renovationism and modernism of certain hierarchs in the 1920s. In the Russian church, these currents produced first the quote living church movement, which with the help of the communist regime tried to overthrow Patriarch Tikhon and quote reform the church in a radically Protestant manner, and then as a more quote conservative successor to the quote living church, the Surginist Church organization, Moscow Patriarchate, which emphasized that the first, the public political side of reconciliation with the communist ideology and aims in accordance with the infamous quote Declaration of Metropolitan Sergius in 1927, and only in recent let's go decades has ventured once again into the realm of ecclesiastical renovationism with its active participation in the ecumenical movement. In the Greek church, the situation has been similar. The renovation, this quote, Pan Orthodox Council of 1923, with its Protestant reforms inspired by Patriarch Molotios Maltekis of Sarius memory, provided it to be too radical for the Orthodox world to accept, and the renovationists had to be satisfied with imposing a calendar reform in several of the non Slavic churches. 4. Large movements of protest against the reforms. Large movements of protest opposed the reformers in both the Russian and Greek churches, produced the deep divisions which uh, exist until now in the Orthodox world. In the Russian Church, Sergianism was decisively rejected by the very many of the bishops and faithful led by Metropolitan Joseph of Petrograd. This quote Josephite movement later became organized to some extent and became known as the quote true Orthodox Church. The history of this illegal, quote, catacomb church of Russia is to this day veiled in secrecy, but in the past few years, a number of startling evidences of its present day activities have come to light, leading to stern repressive measures on the part of the Soviet government. The name of the present chief hierarch, Metropolitan Theodosius, has become known, as has that of one of its 10 or more bishops, Bishop Seraphim. Okay. In the diaspora, the Russian church outside of Russia committed itself from the very beginning of Sergianism in 1927 to affirm an anti Sergianist position, and on numerous occasions it has expressed its solidarity with the true Orthodox Church in Russia, while refusing all communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. Its uncompromisingness and staunch traditionalism in this and other matters were not the taste of several of the Russian hierarchs of the Western Europe and America, who were more receptive to, quote, reform currents in the 20th century Orthodoxy, and they separated themselves at various times from the Russian church outside of Russia, thus creating the present, quote, jurisdictional differences of the Russian diaspora. Uh, in Greece, the movement of protest by similar Orthodox instinct likewise took the name of, quote, the true Orthodox Christians. From the beginning in 1924, when the calendar reform was introduced, this movement had been especially strong among the simple monks, priests, and laymen of Greece. The first bishop to leave the state church of Greece and join the movement was Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina, and today it continues its fully independent life and organization, comprising about a one-fourth of all the Orthodox Christians of Greece, and perhaps one half or more of all the monks and nuns. Although popularly known as the quote, Old Calendarists, the true Orthodox Christians of Greece stand for a staunch traditionalism in Orthodox life and thought in general. Viewing the calendar question merely as the first stage, and a touchstone of modernism and reformism. 5. Increasing sympathy for the anti ecumenist. Second. All right. Right. Increasing in sympathy for the anti-ecumenists. As the ecumenical cancer eats more and more away at the remaining sound organs of the Orthodox churches today, an increasing sympathy is being shown by the most sensitive members of the quote official Orthodox jurisdictions for the cause and the representatives of the anti-ecumenist, anti-reform churches of Russia, Greece, and the diaspora. Okay, so let's go down here. Some seeing the quote official jurisdictions as now irrevocably set on a course of anti orthodoxy are abandoning them as sinking ships and joining the ranks of the true Orthodox Christians. Others, still hoping for the restoration of an Orthodox course in world Orthodoxy, think it is enough for now to express sympathy for the true Orthodox Christians or to protest boldly against the reformist mentality in the official jurisdictions. The 10 years of the anti ecumenist epistles of Metropolitan Philaret, chief hierarch of the Russian Church outside of Russia, have struck a responsive chord within a number of the Orthodox churches even if the quote official response to them has been largely silence or hostility. Today, more than at any time in the last 50 years, struggle to preserve the Orthodox traditions in an age of apostasy. The voice of true, uncompromising Orthodoxy could be heard throughout the world and have a profound effect on the future course of the Orthodox churches. Probably indeed, it is already too late to prevent the renovationist, quote, eighth ecumenical council and the quote ecumenical union which lies beyond it, which perhaps one or more of the local churches may be yet persuaded to step back from this ruinous path, which will lead to the final liquidation as orthodox of those jurisdictions that follow it to the end. And in any case, individuals and whole communities can certainly be saved from this path, not to mention those of the heterodox, who may still find their way into the saving enclosure of the true Church of Christ and return to the patristic path of moderation. Okay, so let's see. It is of critical importance, therefore. Hold on. It is of critical importance, therefore, that this voice actually be true, that it is patristic orthodoxy. Unfortunately, it sometimes happens, especially in the heat of controversy, that basically sound orthodox positions are exaggerated on one side and misunderstood on the other, and thus an entirely misleading impression is created in some minds of those of the cause of true orthodoxy today is a kind of quote extremism or a sort of right wing reaction to the prevailing quote left wing course now followed by the leaders of quote the official Orthodox churches. Such a political view of the struggle of true orthodoxy today is entirely false. This struggle, on the contrary, has taken the form among its best representatives today, whether in Russia, Greece, or the diaspora, or of a returning to the patristic path of moderation in a mean between extremes. That is what the Holy Fathers call the royal path. The teaching of this quote royal path is set forth in the example in the 10th of St. Abba Dorotheus, quote, the spiritual instructions, where he quotes especially the book of Deuteronomy, quote, ye shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left, but go by the royal path. And St. Basil the Great, upright of heart is he whose thoughts does not turn away either to excess or to lack, but is directed towards the mean of virtue. But perhaps this teaching is most clearly expressed by the Orthodox father of the 5th century, St. John Cassian, who was faced with a task not unlike our own Orthodox task today to present the pure teaching of the Eastern fathers to the Western peoples who were spiritually immature and did not yet understand the depth of the subtlety of the Eastern spiritual doctrine and were therefore inclined to go to extremes, either of laxness or over strictness in applying it to life. John Cassian sets forth the orthodox doctrine of the royal path in his conference on, quote, the sober mindedness, or, quote, discretion. The conference is praised by St. John of the latter for its, quote, beautiful and sublime philosophy. Quote, with all our strength and with all our effort, we must strive by humility to acquire for ourselves the good gift of sober mindedness, which can preserve us unharmed by excess from both sides. For as the fathers say, the extremes from both sides are equally harmful, both excess of fasting and filling the belly, excess of vigil and excessive sleep, and other excesses. Sober mindedness, quote, teaches a man to go on the royal path, avoiding the extremes on both sides. On the right side, it does not allow him to be deceived by excessive abstinence. On the left side, to be drawn into carelessness and relaxation. And the temptation on the quote right side is even more dangerous than on the quote left. Quote, excessive abstinence is the more harmful than satiating oneself, because with the cooperation of the repentance, one may go over from the latter to a correct understanding, but from the former one cannot, i.e., because pride over one's quote virtue stands in the way of the repentant humility that could save one. And I see kind of examples of this a lot, honestly. Like that's the danger. Um, thinking you're sort of like too pure, too virtuous. You know, I couldn't be deluded. That's the biggest delusion of them all, isn't it? True orthodoxy does not go into step with the times on the one hand, nor does it make, quote, strictness or correctness or canonicity good in themselves an excuse for fair sake self satisfaction. Hold on. I don't know what's wrong. I'm losing my voice. Okay, so sober minded teaches a man to go on the royal path, avoiding the extremes on both sides. On the right side, it does not allow him to be deceived by excessive abstinence. On the left side, to be drawn into carelessness and relaxation. And the temptation on the quote right side is even more dangerous than on the left. Excessive abstinence is more harmful than satiating oneself, because of the cooperation of repentance. One may go over from the latter to a correct understanding, but from the former one cannot. I.e., because pride over one's quote virtue stands in the way of the repentant humility that could save one. Applying this teaching to our own situation, we may say that the quote royal path of true orthodoxy today is a mean that lies between the extremes of ecumenism and reformism on the one side, and a quote zeal not according to knowledge on the other. True orthodoxy does not go in step with the times on the one hand, nor does it say make strictness or correctness or canonicity good in themselves an excuse for Pharisaic self-satisfaction, exclusivism, and distrust on the other. A big thing with this is, I guess, it kind of proves for those that don't want to hear it, because a lot of people don't want to, I guess, is that which I mean, I think it's kind of interesting because we have Father Peter Ayres, who recently, I think someone told me yesterday, he joined the New Counters Romanians, and he tries to pass off kind of like the royal path as if it's being a new calendar somehow becomes the royal path. Like you could be a new calendar, which that wasn't something that Father Seraphim Rose said. He said to not judge those that unknowingly found themselves under the yoke of the new calendar. But that was kind of like the position of Rokor on a lot of the Moscow Patriarch people, because a lot of those people didn't necessarily know they were under communist, and when they were early on translating the catacomb documents, you kind of look at the position of Saint Kirill of Kazan. And what he said is that the mysteries of the Sergius were grace filled mysteries for the average Russian believer that went into communion sincerely, not knowing that they were taking communion from a Sergius. So that's an interesting distinction. A lot of people don't like talking about, but this was his position. He said those people, when they go in there and they don't know, then they're fine. They actually receive Holy Communion. But it's the person that does know that he's receiving communion from the Sergius, and does know all the evil acts that are going on. And the Sergius, of course, themselves is committing blasphemy by mocking the Holy Church, by being a communist and dressing up in a Cossack. So that's a distinction that's not often talked about, I think, that needs to kind of be talked about. Because, and they'll be like, oh well, I seen Orthodox Wisdom posted something about Elder Tavarian, who was he was a catacomb priest that had joined the Moscow Patriarchate at a certain point. And the view it was like, Rokor seen some effort within the Moscow Patriarchate to stand against the forces of Antichrist. But there was this strong opposition between these communist clergy and these truly Orthodox believers that were just under the communist yoke, right? And, some of the parishes were would be separate from, so you could kind of be in the Moscow Patriarchate without being under the, kind of like the grip of the Patriarchate. And some of them, there were certain bishops that had no clue what were going on, because they were kind of just like in the dark. They weren't told anything, because they, you can imagine, like, I don't know, for Orthodox people that have ever been into a monastery, you very well can know, like, you could be within a jurisdiction and not leave your little like isolated place as an ascetic and not know what the Sergius were doing and be in the Moscow Patriarchate at one time. But I mean, I don't know. So there's little nuances like that we, that oftentimes Orthodox people, especially World Orthodox people, that try to defend this type, the ecumenist or the Sergianist or the Moscow Patriarchate, they kind of go back and talk about these Elder Tavarians and stuff. But this guy was a catacomb priest who went up and was like, look, the catacomb church is underground. I'm going to go to the Moscow Patriarchate and I'm going to start giving Holy Communion, and I'm going to try to, fight for Orthodoxy and uproot the communists. I mean, it didn't end up working out. And there was a similar dissident. They were called dissidents, Father Dmitry Dutko. But the issue with Father Dmitry Dutko, it's like at a certain point, he renounces everything he said, and starts, issuing out these like passionate diatribes, like praising Stalin or whatever. And, St. Philaret was asked about it, and St. Philaret said, it happened because he was protesting outside of the body of Christ. So clearly they seen, the Moscow Patriarchate as this very faulty, like iffy thing, because they knew it was created by Stalin. They know the majority of the clergy or KGB agents, Were there a couple like really truly believing people there? Yes, there was, and I think that's what you're seeing from ROCOR is like an effort to make sure that those people are recognized that they're under this yoke. But it's a very different thing to say like, okay, these people in the 80s that were under the yoke of the communists compared to the modern day, person in ROCOR MP who willingly goes into communion with the surgeons. Like those are two very different things. And a lot of these guys are knowing about it. They know fully well about it and they just make excuses for it. So this true Orthodox moderation is not to be confused with mere lukewarmness or indifference with any kind of compromise between political extremes. The spirit of, quote, reform is so much in the air today that uh, anyone whose views are molded by the, quote, spirit of the times will regard true Orthodox moderation as, quote, to fanaticism. But anyone who looks at the question more deeply and applies the patristic standard will find the royal path to be far from any kind of extremism. Perhaps no Orthodox teacher in our own days provides such an example of sound and fervent Orthodox moderation as the late Archbishop Averky of Jordanville. His numerous articles and sermons breathe a refreshing spirit of true Orthodox zealotry without any deviation either to the quote right or to the left, and with the emphasis constantly on the spiritual side of true Orthodoxy. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia transverses the royal path and supports the Russian true Orthodox of Russia and Greece. The Russian Church outside of Russia has been placed by the God's providence in a very favorable position for preserving the royal path. Amidst the confusion of so much of the 20th century Orthodoxy, living in exile and poverty in a world that has not understood the suffering of her people, she has focused her attention on preserving unchanged the faith which unites her people, and so quite naturally defines herself a stranger to the whole ecumenical mentality, which is based on religious indifference and self satisfaction, material affluence, and soulless internationalism. On the other hand, she has been preserved from falling into extremisms on the right side, such as might be declared that the mysteries of the Moscow Patriarchate are without grace, by her vivid awareness that the Sergius Church in Russia is not free. One can, of course, have no communion with such a body, dominated by atheists, but precise definitions of its status are best left to a free Russian Church Council in the future. If there seems to be a quote logical contradiction here, you don't deny her mysteries, why don't you have communion with her? It is problem only for true rationalists. Those who approach such questions with the heart as well as the head have no trouble accepting this position, which is the testament bequeathed to the Russian Church of the diaspora by her wise chief hierarch Metropolitan Apostasy in 1965. Living in freedom, the Russian Church outside of Russia has considered as one of her important obligations to express her solidarity in full communion with the underground true Orthodox Church of Russia, whose existence is totally ignored and even denied, quote, by official Orthodoxy. In God's time, when the terrible trial of the Russian Church and people will have passed, the other Orthodox churches might understand the Russian situation better. Until then, it is perhaps all one can hope for that the free Orthodox churches have never questioned the right of the Russian Orthodox Church to exist or deny the grace of her mysteries. Almost all of them have long remained in communion with her until her non participation in the ecumenical movement isolated her and made her a reproach to the other churches, especially in the last decade. Up to this day, they have at least passively resisted the politically inspired attempts of the Moscow Patriarchate to have her declared, quote, schismatic and, quote, uncanonical. In recent years, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia has also given support and recognition to the true Orthodox Christians of Greece, whose situation also has long been exceedingly difficult and misunderstood. In Greece, the first blow against the church, the calendar reform, was not as deadly as the declaration of the Metropolitan Sergius in Russia, and for this reason has taken longer for the theological consciousness of the Orthodox Greek people to see it as a full and anti-Orthodox significance. Further, few bishops in Greece have been bold enough to join the movement, whereas by contrast, the number of non-Orthodox, non-Sergianist bishops in the beginning was larger than the whole episcopate of the Greek Church. Father Seraphim goes on to say, and he goes, and in recent years, as the cause of the old calendar has become even a little, quote, intellectually respectable, as more and more university graduates have joined in, over the years, it has suffered persecution, sometimes quite fierce, from the state and the official church, and to this day it remains disdained by the, quote, sophisticated and totally without recognition from the, quote, official Orthodox world. Unfortunately, internal disagreements and divisions have continued to weaken the cause of the old calendars, and they lack a single unanimous voice to express their stand for patristic orthodoxy. Still, the basic orthodoxy of their position cannot be denied, and one can only welcome such sound presentations of it as may be seen in the article that follows. 8. A united front of confessing churches. The increasing realization in recent years of the basic oneness of the cause of true orthodoxy throughout the world, whether in the Catacomb Church of Russia, the old calendars of Greece, or the Russian Church outside of Russia, has led some to think in terms of a united front of confessing churches to oppose the ecumenical movement which has taken possession of, quote, official orthodoxy. However, under present conditions, this will hardly come to pass. In any case, this is a, quote, political view of the situation which sees the significance of the mission of true orthodoxy in too external a manner. The full dimensions of the true Orthodox protest against, quote, ecumenical orthodoxy, against the neutralized, lukewarm orthodoxy of the apostasy, have yet to be revealed, above all in Russia. But it cannot be that the witness of so many martyrs and confessors and champions of true orthodoxy in the 20th century will be in vain. May God preserve his zealots in the royal path of true orthodoxy, faithful to him and to his holy church until the end of the age. Okay, so there we go. We got through it. How's everybody doing? All right. Well, let's see what else we could go to real quick. I don't know. Let me look through my library. You know what I'll do? I'll drop a link too, and just in case somebody wants to stop by. I don't know. Who knows? Well,
Okay, so first of all, I have a couple of appearances that you can also put down on your calendars. I mentioned just as we were leaving the Mexican Revolution that I would be in London at the Waterstones on Gower Street on May the 28th, and indeed I will be. Unfortunately, I had schedule conflicts that meant I was unable to expand the trip, and also, unfortunately, the event is already sold out. It got announced about 6 weeks ago while I was on hiatus and sold out within about a day. So if you have tickets, by all means come. If not, well, I'll come back, I promise. Second, I will also be in New York on Saturday, June the 29th. This is something that just came together very quickly for an event called Intelligent Speech, which is a project spearheaded by a friend of the show, Royfield Brown, that is bringing together history podcasters from all over the world to talk about, well, whatever it is we want to talk about. My presentation is tentatively titled, What is the Point of All This? It will be a day long thing. I'll put a link to the website for tickets and stuff along with the show notes. And I'll also release an ad that Royfield put together to publish the event. So I'll be there. Kevin Stroud from the History of English, David Crowther from the History of England. We'll all be in New York on June the 29th. I will also be doing a similar thing this October at Harvard for the Sound Education Conference, which I managed to miss last year because I was so discombobulated from the move to Paris, and then saw basically every history podcaster I know was there and resolved not to miss it in 2019. I'm actually going to be giving a keynote address. So come see me and other history podcasters be nerdy about history and podcasting. Again, I'll put links to all this stuff in the show notes. Now, as for the state of this here Revolutions podcast, I have said previously that I'll be wrapping up in mid 2021 to coincide with the release of Citizen Lafayette. So that's about 2 years from now. And we are here today commencing the Russian Revolution. What comes after the Russian Revolution, but before the end of the show, I don't really know for a variety of reasons. First of all, the Russian Revolution is a big, complicated revolution. Whether or not it surpasses the episode count of the French Revolution, which wrapped up at 55 episodes, the Russian Revolution is definitely going to be, at a minimum, the second longest series I have done. That is a title currently held by the Revolutions of 1848 at a cool 33 episodes, and we're just going to blow right past that. One of the reasons we're going to blow right past that is that individual episodes of Revolutions are going to be shorter. When I started the show, they were about 25 minutes long, so roughly the length of an old History of Rome episode. Then they started creeping up and made a very big jump around the Haitian Revolution, and ever since then, they've been routinely clocking in at 40 minutes. Now, it may not seem like much, but trust me, cranking out 5,500 words worth of research notes, rough drafting, editing, and recording, that's a lot. And now that I'm moving into really writing Citizen Lafayette and would like to continue to interact with my family, whom I love, something needs to give. So I'm going to go back to my roots. I'm not going to cover less in total. I'm just going to spread it out over more episodes because they're going to have to be shorter. So 55 episodes on the Russian Revolution. I would advise you to take despotism of the directory and then the episode 10.1, the International Working Men's Association. Welcome to our series on the Great Russian Revolution, which in the history of revolutions is probably second only to the French Revolution in terms of importance, impact, and then ongoing historiographic controversy and debate.
I wanted to
But
kind of go to
unlike the
this
French
today, and I'll tell
Revolution,
you
and
why.
indeed,
Because so there's a portion of this where it kind of talks about Marx and this First International and Mazzini and this coming together of this First International. And I think that's a super important subject because the way the oligarchs viewed the First International, I guess, needs to be understood, and how these Marx viewed this situation, like, this plot to overthrow monarchy and kind of turn the world upside down, and using this like economic plan as the scapegoat or the manipulation to get it done, right? And then it's sort of like this training ground for revolutionaries, and you can see kind of like the development where it's very satanic, it's kabbalistic, like the way these people think and like manipulate something. Um, yeah, and I think that's why I'm covering it right now. I mean, I kind of want to bring attention to the subject at least.
Because of the French Revolution. The men and women who made the Russian Revolution were actively longing to embark on a world historical event. Guys like Danton, Desmoulins, and Robespierre had improvised their way through a great upheaval. But now, would be revolutionary adepts like Lenin and Trotsky studied the course of the French Revolution and then spent their whole lives planning for and anticipating a new great revolution. Not that the Russian Revolution is not also defined by spur of the moment improvisations, just that the revolutionaries were aiming from the beginning at something as big as the French Revolution, and I think they succeeded. Now, before the Russian Revolution came along and added a new great revolution for everyone to focus attention on, be afraid of, want to emulate, etc., the French Revolution continued to hang over European affairs as the revolution that everybody focused their attention on, was scared of, or wanted to emulate. And if you remember back to the episode I did in our series on 1848 called The Spectre of the French Revolution, we talked about how the French Revolution played such a huge role in defining one's position inside of 19th century politics. That on the one hand, you had anti revolutionaries. This group included both full throated reactionary conservatives like Metternich, but also liberal constitutional monarchists like Francois Guizot, who believed that any further democratic or social reform would be the first step towards the return of Madame la Guillotine. But this group also included liberal reformers like Alexis de Tocqueville in France, the Count of Cavour in Piedmont, Sardinia, and István Széchenyi in Hungary, who were anti revolution, but who believed that slow and steady reform was just the thing that would prevent that revolution, not trigger it. On the other hand, there were those who thought, actually, hell yeah, little revolution is just what the doctor ordered. And they broke into three camps, those representing what we might call the spirit of 1789. Yes, revolution against lingering feudal absolutism, but always guarding against the slip into mob driven chaos in the Reign of Terror. Then, beyond them, there were those representing the spirit of 1792, radical democratic Republicans who believed 1789 was the unsatisfying precursor to the much more important and much more glorious revolution of 1792, which ushered in real political liberty and social equality. Finally, there was this weird and obscure minority representing what we might call the spirit of 1796, those who saw 1789 as a step to 1792, but who also saw 1792 as a step towards the aborted promise of 1796, represented by Gracchus Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals. They believed that the liberty and equality espoused even by the radical Republicans would be impossible without economic equality, that it was not enough to declare the rights of man if the wealth of the nation was still unequally distributed, that simply transferring land and capital from a dying aristocracy to a rising bourgeoisie was no revolution at all, especially not as the idealism of the revolution gave way to the cynicism and despotism of the Directory, and then the Consulate, and then the Empire. It was this last group that first asked the social question, and as the 19th century progressed, their demands for an answer only grew louder, and it is from that tiny seed, from the spirit of 1796, that we find the origins of the Russian Revolution, a social revolution to match the size and scope of the merely political French Revolution. It was, in fact, during the cynical and despotic days of the Consulate and the Empire that the first batch of new commentators and critics and reformers wanted to address the failed promise of the French Revolution. They were not yet called socialists because that word and concept didn't really exist yet, but in retrospect, we recognize them as such. These early utopian socialists were highly critical of the failures of the disciples of the enlightened philosophes to produce anything resembling a just society. But this first generation of proto-socialists did not yet abandon capital R reason as the proper tool to eradicate social and political injustice. The oldest and most influential of this generation was the Comte de Saint-Simon. As a young man, Saint-Simon had served in the French expeditionary force that went to fight in the American War of Independence and returned an enthusiastic partisan of the coming French Revolution. Keenly interested in the scientific improvement of human society, he managed to survive the Reign of Terror despite a brief imprisonment, and then spent the rest of his life developing a framework for a scientifically perfected society. Once people understood that humans were governed by empirically determined laws, a social science to match what Newton had done for physics, people would be able to create a harmonious society devoid of poverty, suffering, crime, and every other social ill. Now, Saint Simon did not preach radical communal equalitarianism so much as a technocratic meritocracy that would just render the political state obsolete. And if we're connecting dots here to other parts of the Revolution's podcast, one of Saint Simon's secretaries was Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, and more specifically, positivism, which we saw get picked up by the Mexican cientificos during the Porfiriato. Saint Simon, no less than Porfirio Diaz, wanted not much politics and a lot of administration. A younger contemporary of Saint Simon's was Charles Fourier, a trenchant and witty social critic of post-revolutionary France who developed full-blown and very detailed theories about the ideal environment for the flourishing of both individuals and the community within which they lived, that the individual should not be molded to fit society, but that society should be molded to fit the individual. Like Saint Simon, Fourier believed that his great project was to discover laws of human relations to match Newton's physics. And he thought he cracked it with a very complicated metaphysics based on types of human attraction and passion that, once recognized and set free, would allow human communities to fall into a voluntary, natural, and harmonious balance. To help this process along, Fourier developed schemes for networks of 4-story complexes where 1,620 members would work and live, doing work that was tailored to their own proclivities and talents and passions, so that labor would cease to be labor and instead become pleasure. Again, armed with capital R reason, human conflict, poverty, and misery would be overcome. Fourier gained enough adherents that in the 1840s, at least 30 utopian communities were established in the United States based off of his ideas. None of them turned out to be utopia, leaving behind instead a legacy of plaques and historical markers that say, on this date, in this place, humans once attempted to build a utopia. The last of this early group that I'll mention is Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist who took over a factory in New Lanark, Scotland in January of 1800 and proceeded to use it as a testing ground for his reformist theories about how individuals, families, and communities ought to live and work. Basically, Owen thought that though biology played a role in human development, so too did the environment within which they lived. In the beginning, this took the form of a kind of benevolent capitalism. At his factory, Owen instituted 10-hour maximum workdays. He insisted that company stores sell goods essentially at cost. He covered the education of children. He built good housing for the families. And for a long time, he was lauded in polite society for his noble, and more importantly, productive, efforts. But after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Owen grew more radical, and he advanced from benevolent capitalist to outright socialist. This turned him from darling of polite society to pariah, but Owen didn't care. He started dumping his fortune into an attempt to build an ideal society, eventually buying an entire town in Indiana called New Harmony, where he tried to build his utopia. But this utopia failed within 2 years because history has shown time and again that human nature and idealistic utopian schemes go together like oil and water. Owen was financially ruined by all this, but he remained an active promoter of worker rights right up until his death in 1858. And he played a role in advancing nearly every piece of British labor legislation in the first half of the 19th century. And he was the one who coined the enduring phrase, 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, and 8 hours rest as the perfect balance for the human day, which is a motto that still has some currency today.
Big news, America! Wegovy now comes in a pill.
This early utopian socialism was mostly of interest to a few dreamers and eccentric do-gooders, hoping to change the world by force of example. Socialism as an active revolutionary political force was still barely in its infancy when the revolutions of 1848 broke out, though one of the greatest statements of revolutionary socialism was produced right on the eve of the revolution, and that's the Communist Manifesto. But the Communist League, who was issuing this Communist Manifesto, was an obscure group who had almost no impact on immediate revolutionary events, and the Communist Manifesto is only important in historical retrospect. The hurricane of 1848, though, scrambled things up and sent people and ideas flying everywhere. And after that storm passed, people took stock of what had happened. They drew lessons from their failures, and they began the process of building a stronger and more advanced socialist challenge to the political and economic status quo. The lessons learned were varied and often contradictory. Those, for example, who followed Pierre-Auguste Blanqui, the professional revolutionary par excellence, continued to insist that the solution was to create a hardcore professional vanguard of revolutionaries who could be trusted to be ruthless and see the job of toppling the tyrants of Europe done properly. This is not surprising, because that was Blanqui's solution to every problem. If Blanqui's car blew a tire, he would first want to forge a hardcore dedicated revolutionary vanguard before he thought about where to get a new tire. This vanguard would be secretive, few in number, and deadly in impact. They would not be distracted or dissuaded by weak-kneed liberals or ignorant workers who knew nothing of revolutionary politics. A diametrically opposed takeaway from the failures of 1848 came from Blanqui's contemporary, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the first self-described anarchist, who counseled ignoring the state and politics completely. Don't focus on overthrowing the state, just ignore it. Build worker collectives and voluntary associations as an alternative to coercive and exploitive capitalism. These voluntary associations will grow and spread, and the next thing you know, we don't even need a revolution because it's already done. There were also those who existed in between those extremes, and who still believed that the answer to the social question could only come after political liberation. In France, this group would count among its number the neo-Jacobin Republicans, the spirit of 1792 guys, and elsewhere in Europe, those who still followed the national liberation doctrines and methods of Giuseppe Mazzini, that we must first focus on overthrowing the reactionary political powers that keep free nations in bondage, and then we can deal with the rest of it. It's fair to say, though, that in the years after 1848, those reactionary political powers were ascendant, and the power of these revolutionaries was limited, to say the least. They had been scattered and decimated by voluntary exile, forced deportation, execution, and imprisonment. So though one must always keep a watchful eye, the threat of revolution from below was pretty minimal. The violent aberration of 1848 thus survived. The great powers of Europe could get back to quote-unquote normal history, making war on each other, mostly to satisfy the dynastic ambitions of Europe's rulers. Prince President Bonaparte's coup of 1851 and subsequent creation of the Second French Empire ended what had been a pretty good run of great power peace since the fall of the first Napoleon back in 1815. And within a few years, Napoleon III was teaming up with the British to go fight the Russians in the Crimean War. And then a few years later, France teamed up with Piedmont Sardinia to fight the Austrians and restart the process of Italian liberation and unification. To match and counter the ambitions of Napoleon III, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck decided in the early 1860s that the time was just about right to make a play to consolidate the still disunited states of Germany under Prussian domination. At this same time, another nation of long-standing suffering renewed its dream of liberation and unification. I speak, of course, of Poland, around whom all revolutionary history must ultimately revolve. Wiped from the map of Europe by Prussia, Austria, and Russia in the 1790s, and not reconstituted in the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, the keepers of the old flame of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had tried to restore themselves in the early 1830s, and then again during the revolutions of 1848, but had failed both times. With both Russia and Austria having recently been knocked around, Poland saw the rise of clandestine meetings, public demonstrations, and violent clashes all through 1860, 1861, and 1862. Patriotic Poles divided between one group of more conservative liberals, intellectuals, and professionals who wanted essentially home rule, akin to something like what the Hungarians were about to get from the Habsburgs, and more radical lower-class workers and peasants who wanted to overthrow their foreign oppressors and found a free Polish republic. Disunited, but mostly marching in the same direction, The situation exploded in January of 1863 with a full-blown armed uprising, followed in February by an uprising in Lithuania. Now, the plight of Poland had long been a cause to rally around for everyone basically to the left of Metternich since 1815, especially in France. In the very last years of his life, Lafayette was very much focused on Poland and trying to help exiled Poles in Paris, and he even accepted a commission in the Polish National Guard. No, you're writing a biography of Lafayette and awkwardly shoehorning him into the story. This latest Polish uprising led to various radical and socialist groups wanting to show solidarity with the Poles. And so in July of 1863, a small group of French working class leaders made the trip from Paris to London to participate in a large meeting at St. James's Hall in solidarity with the Polish insurgents, hosted by English working class leaders. The French delegation was mostly made up of mutualist anarchist followers of Proudhon. And at the meeting, the French leaders and the English leaders started discussing the fact that they really had a lot of problems in common, and that international solidarity of the working classes might be the only way to find the elusive answer to the social question. They all, of course, had their own national concerns, but it couldn't hurt to think about building up an alliance from below. Talks about building up such an alliance continued all through 1863 and 1864 until some details were finalized. Invitations were written and received for a meeting to be held in London in September of 1864. This one not just on behalf of the Poles, whose uprising unfortunately had already been crushed, but to discuss what an international working men's association might look like, if such a thing was feasible or even desirable. This meeting opened at St. Martin's Hall on September the 28th, 1864, and brought together quite an array of reformers and revolutionaries who had very little in common besides a general alienation from the social, economic, and political status quo. So there were British labor unionists and idealistic holdover Owenites. There were French Proudhonists and Blanquists who spoke a common language, but who had little else in common. There were Irish, Italian, and Polish nationalists who sought national liberation above all, among them many disciples of Mazzini's hardcore Republican Young Europe movement. Also present were a few ponderous and philosophically inclined German socialists. The men, and at this point they were all men, who gathered did not agree on a solution to the social question, nor did they really even agree on what the problem was. But there was a sense that as long as the enemies of the status quo remained separated from each other, that the reactionary defenders of the status quo who controlled the wealth and armies of their respective countries would always win. Sharing an enemy, they hoped that they could become allies, if not quite friends. Those assembled in St. Martin's Hall voted unanimously to found an International Working Men's Association, which they then creatively dubbed the International Working Men's Association. This is a bit of a mouthful, so in time it became known as simply the International, and is known to us today as the First International, because in the decades to come there would be a Second International and a Third International and a Fourth International, but let's not worry about them, because nobody at the meeting at St. Martin's Hall in 1864 knew that they were forming merely the First International. So among the small contingent of ponderous and philosophically inclined German socialists at this meeting was an exile from the Revolution of 1848 who had been living in London with his family since 1849. This guy was not particularly important. He didn't even know about the meeting until a week before it was held, and was invited practically just because the organizers wanted the meeting to be as international as possible and they needed some more Germans. He was at that point known principally as a radical journalist and polemicist, with a penchant for indulging in catfights with other members of the emigre and exile communities where he had lived in Germany, Belgium, France, and the UK. If you haven't guessed by now, I am, of course, talking about 46-year-old Karl Marx. So we're going to talk much more about the life and ideas of Marx next week, because though he is obscure at this moment, he obviously looms large over the revolution and every subsequent revolution in the 20th century. In fact, part of the reason we're here talking about the founding of the International Working Men's Association is because this is the organization that helps take Marx from obscure and isolated grump to an intellectual leader with actual followers. Again, partly because he was simply a German who lived in London, Marx was appointed to an executive general council of 21 men who would guide the formation of this new working men's association. Now, Marx wasn't really planning on playing a huge role on this council, and over the next few days, he only sporadically attended meetings. But then it was brought to his attention that the followers of Mazzini were coming to dominate the council, and that seemed to get Marx off his ass, because Marx and Mazzini hated each other personally and professionally. So when the larger General Council created a smaller committee to actually work on drafts for the rules and opening statement of the new International Working Men's Association, Marx not only got himself on the committee, but he offered to host their meeting at his house. And given the fact that this was a working class operation, and he was likely the most gifted writer amongst them, he got this smaller drafting committee to delegate to him individually the task of drafting these crucial founding documents of the International. The documents he produced at the end of October 1864 were unanimously approved on November the 1st and let Marx put his early stamp on the International. Now, at this point, there was no such thing as Marxists. Marx himself had very few friends, let alone followers, in the early 1860s. But he coded a bunch of very Marxist language into the DNA of the International Working Men's Association. The inaugural address begins by breaking down the phenomenal growth of the capitalist economy since 1848, and then laying out all the ways that the workers have been screwed over. That despite massive percentage growth in profits and productivity, that the conditions of the life of the workers was appalling. It was worse than at any point in history, that they were not even receiving sufficient calories to stay alive, and that this was all according to the British government's own reports. The address lamented the destruction of the nascent working class movements in 1848 and went on to praise efforts to ameliorate the worst conditions by various reformers in the 1850s. But then Marx slipped in some editorializing aimed at mutualist anarchists who supported non-confrontational cooperatives that would supplant the ruling capitalist class rather than accepting the necessary logic of class conflict to overthrow their power. Marx wrote, quote, "The experience of the period from 1848 to 1864 has proved beyond doubt that, however excellent in principle and however useful in practice, cooperative labor, if kept within the narrow circle of the casual efforts of private workmen, will never be able to arrest the growth in geometrical progression of monopoly, to free the masses, nor even to perceptibly lighten the burdens of their miseries." Marx went so far as to say outright that such cooperatives were welcomed by their oppressors because they would distract the workers from the real threat that the workers posed, that what they had was numbers, and that if they combined internationally, that they could be a force of great revolutionary strength. So for Marx, social revolution lay through the seizing of political power, and he wrote, quote, "To conquer political power has, therefore, become the great duty of the working classes," end quote. Marx also drafted the general rules of the International, which were prefaced by more strong language that followed from his own analysis of the situation. He wrote, quote, "that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. That is, they can't rely on any other class or group, neither friendly aristocrats nor charitable bourgeois liberals. They must do it for themselves." He also wrote, quote, "that the economical subjection of the man of labor to the monopolizer of the means of labor, that is, the source of life, lies at the bottom of servitude in all its forms, of all its social misery, mental degradation, and political dependence. That the economical emancipation of the working classes is therefore the great end to which every political movement ought to be subordinate as a means." So clearly, the social question must always take precedence, that mere political rights and constitutions aren't going to be enough to magically solve the problem. But that said, political power was a key component of the answer to the social question. But though what everyone would later understand to be very Marxist language being coded into the DNA of the First International, the actual rules of the organization were very clear that this was meant to attract as many affiliates as possible and not have some doctrinal litmus test for membership. The inaugural address was just that and nothing more. The General Council in London would be there to act as a coordinating and correspondence bureau, not some central executive handing down orders from on high. In fact, all somebody had to do to join was, quote, acknowledge truth, justice, and morality as the basis of their conduct toward each other and toward all men without regard to color, creed, or nationality. There would be lots of latitude about how national, local, and individual groups who elected to affiliate with the international could operate. Self-directed autonomy and freedom of ideological choice was literally in the rules, and it said, while united in perpetual bond of fraternal cooperation, the working men's societies joining the International Association will preserve their existing organizations intact. This meant, for example, that whatever shots Marx had just taken at Proudhon's mutualists, that the vast majority of French sections that affiliated with the International were mutualist anarchists. And really, up through the Paris Commune, it was the followers of Proudhon, not Marx, who were the single most advanced and influential faction inside the International. The founding of the International Working Men's Association was a momentous event in the history of labor, socialism, communism, anarchism, and revolution. It was also the beginning of a hot, holy mess of disagreement and rivalry between those who now affiliated with the International. Intentionally casting the net as wide as possible was the point, but that meant that every fish in the sea wound up coming on board, and that would produce some major conflicts. And just to give you a flavor of some of these disputes, British Union leaders wanted this all to be a reformist movement. Continental radicals demanded full-blown revolution. Professional revolutionaries who followed Blanqui wanted this to be a secretive and focused vanguard, while others, like Marx himself, wanted it to be an out-in-the-open mass movement. Some supported union activity as a necessary focus for worker direct action, while many anarchists hated the unions because they granted the capitalist premise that some were powerful owners while others were mere workers. The anarchists instead wanted to emphasize worker-owned collectives, not organizing factories for better wages. Some felt that the international movement couldn't work without powerful direction from a central authority giving orders from the top down. Others thought that it would be pointless if it wasn't an inverted pyramid built from the bottom up, with the guys at the center working for those at the periphery, not the other way around. Some wanted to form political parties and challenge parliamentary elections. Others thought that politics was the whole problem, and they needed to decisively turn their backs on the entire game of politics and build up their own alternative structures. Some believed in capturing the power of the state, others in ignoring its very existence until, like a forgotten god, it simply disappeared. But for the moment, all these disagreements were papered over, and it was with a great deal of hope and optimism that the International Working Men's Association was founded in 1864. The International would soon be tested by all those internal disputes, and then really tested by the explosion of the Franco-Prussian War, the siege of Paris, and the creation of the Paris Commune. As the years went by, Marx's influence would continue to grow as he kept a close, if behind-the-scenes eye on how the International presented and directed itself, eventually bringing him into conflict with the collectivist anarchists who started joining in the later 1860s under the auspices of the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. The personal and ideological conflict between Marx and Bakunin would define the remaining history of the First International, as well as the future of revolutionary politics, as the schism between communists and anarchists would have profound implications for the course of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917 and beyond. So, over the next few episodes, we will talk about the life of Marx and his theories of economics, politics, history, and revolution, and then talk about Bakunin and his theories of economics, politics, history, and revolution. And thus armed, we can go forth and aim ourselves at the institution that both believed more than any other stood for tyrannical, reactionary oppression, the Russian Tsar.
You're Your setup wants Opera GX.
Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 10.2, The Adventures of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We launched this series last week by launching the International Working Men's Association in 1864. Mostly, I did this because the International tried to bring all left-wing political groups together under a single tent. And since I'm trying to avoid making the Russian Revolution the narrow story of the Bolsheviks, it seemed like a good way to establish that the Bolsheviks are going to emerge as one faction that represented one variant of Russian Marxism. But there were a lot of other factions and variants out there: unionists, anarchists, socialists, communists, reformers, revolutionaries. But all that said, the Bolsheviks are ultimately the victorious faction from the victorious variant of Marxism, so it's going to be important to understand where they came from. So as the title of this episode suggests, today will be an intertwined biographical sketch of the lives of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that will take us through to the foundation of the International. And then next week, we will go through the critical concepts to understand the philosophy and revolutionary program that became known as Marxism. Then we'll go on to do the same for Bakunin and the anarchists so that we understand what core revolutionary principles were out there that opposed what some people saw as the authoritarian tendencies implicit in that Marxism. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the city of Trier, a middle-sized city in the Rhineland. Little Karl was born just 3 years after the final fall of Napoleon. Now, Trier had been under French administration going back to the 1790s, but at the very recent Congress of Vienna, it was handed to the Prussian monarchy, whose backward-looking feudal conservatism clashed with the more progressive and forward-looking Rhinelanders. Both of Karl's parents had ethnic Jewish lineage, but to maintain his budding legal practice, Marx's father converted to Protestantism when the Prussians took over and instituted more carefully draconian restrictions on what Jews could and could not do. Not that this conversion was anything but nominal. Marx's father was into Kant and Voltaire and the Enlightenment, and though his children were baptized Lutheran, they were hardly a religious bunch. Karl then got a good enough secondary education where he was sent to the University of Bonn in 1835 to study law. But Karl's first year at university was mostly filled with drinking beer and reckless brawling, and so his dad shipped him off to the University of Berlin, which was located in the capital of the kingdom. Before Karl departed, he proposed marriage to Jenny von Westphalen, the daughter of a minor noble civil servant. And though the couple were only together in person once over the next 5 years, and that one time they got together almost wrecked their relationship, their engagement held. And when they finally got married, they remained together through the occasionally thick and very often thin rest of their lives. Arriving in Berlin in 1836, Karl did something even worse than drinking and brawling. He became enamored with philosophy. In Germany, in the mid-1830s, getting into philosophy meant getting into the just recently deceased Hegel, whose philosophy cast an all-encompassing shadow over German intellectual life, especially here in the first half of the 19th century. We'll talk a little bit more next week about what concepts Marx pulled out of Hegel, but for now, the crowd Marx fell in with was the more radical and iconoclastic group called the Young Hegelians. The Young Hegelians were working from themes that came from the early days of the French Revolution, and they took Hegel seriously when he said that the purpose and course of history was all about the abolition of anything that restricts freedom and the use of reason. The Young Hegelians were obviously critical of the repressive Prussian government, but unable to express their opposition openly, they turned to theology and philosophy. They published challenges to the reliability, historicity, and believability of Christianity and the Bible. They believed that by doing this, they could undermine one of the core pillars of the Prussian monarchy's alleged legitimacy. Marx fell in with the Young Hegelians at the worst possible moment, because while their controversial philosophy was tolerated by King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, when he died in 1840 and his son, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, ascended to power, that tolerance evaporated. Now, you know Friedrich Wilhelm IV from our episodes on 1848 because he will be the King of Prussia during the revolutions of 1848. He's the one who had to crawl on his belly away from Berlin. Conservative, romantic, and evangelical, this Friedrich Wilhelm had no tolerance for seditious blasphemy, and so the young Hegelians were marked and blacklisted. In spite of this, Marx pressed on with a doctoral thesis that used Hegelian methods to analyze ancient metaphysics, even though his conclusions were now outside the boundaries of acceptable thinking. Knowing he couldn't submit his thesis to the University of Berlin, Marx instead sent it to the more permissive University of Jena, which made him a doctor of philosophy in 1841. But as I just said, this was a bad time to be a young Hegelian, and Marx's dream of a university position was squelched. To make matters worse, Marx's father had died in 1838, beginning endless rounds of bickering with his money over money from the inheritance. To make a living, Marx, like many of his ideological comrades, turned from academia to journalism. So this newly minted doctor of philosophy moved to Cologne, where he submitted articles to a progressive paper called the Rhineland News, showing off a rhetorical style that was acerbic, witty, intelligent, sarcastic, and occasionally savage. This was also the period that, by his own account, he started being handed socialist and communist ideas, moving him away from abstract philosophy towards the realities of social and economic life. When the editorial brain trust of the Rhineland News fell apart, Marx became its de facto editor-in-chief in the middle of 1842. The paper was successful, and that looked like that. Karl Marx was going to be a newspaper editor in Cologne. But the paranoid hand of conservative censorship dug up Marx's new roots before they even had a chance to settle. The Rhineland News was suppressed and banned in 1843. Whatever plans Marx may have had for a normal life with a steady income were turned upside down by his politics. During his stint with the Rhineland News, Marx came into contact with a young, semi-anonymous contributor named Friedrich Engels. Engels was 2.5 years younger than Marx, born in 1820 in Barmen, a city about 35 miles east of Cologne. The Engels family were, first, devout evangelical Protestants, and second, industrial pioneers in the Rhineland. They owned textile factories in the region and had further expanded up to Manchester, England, which was rapidly transforming into a hive of industrial factories. The scion of this rich, capitalist, and very religious family rebelled on nearly every front. In 1842, Engels did a requisite year in the Prussian army, and stationed in Berlin, he attended lectures and came into social and intellectual contact with both the young Hegelians and various proto-socialists. Engels took to thinking and writing, and he submitted pieces to the Rhineland News, anonymously, as I said, since he was the son of filthy rich capitalists. Scandalized by their son's new friends and his new ideas, his parents sent him to Manchester to apprentice in a family-owned factory there. And in the annals of parents trying to halt the radicalization of their children only to see it backfire, sending Friedrich Engels to Manchester may be the single greatest backfire in world history. Now, despite having lost his job, Karl Marx and Jenny von Westphalen married and moved to Paris in October of 1843. Under the semi-liberal auspices of the July Monarchy, Paris was a haven for emigre radicals from across Europe. Russians and Poles, Italians, Germans, Spaniards, creating a swirling milieu of nationalists and Democrats, socialists, anarchists, tepid reformers, and single-minded revolutionaries. The Marxes settled down, and their first daughter, little Jenny, was born in early 1844. Marx worked as a contributor and editor for a couple of different German-language publications, meant for audiences in the emigre community, but also for audiences back in Germany. None of this work, though, was steady or particularly profitable. Engels, meanwhile, went off to Manchester, where he embarked on a program of self-radicalization. He was absolutely appalled by what he found there. Shortly after arriving, Engels met an Irish worker named Mary Burns. they fell in love and began a 20-year non-marriage marriage where they never tied the knot because they both rejected the oppressive bourgeois institution that was marriage. Mary Burns was Engels's early guide to Manchester, and he was deeply affected by what he saw. And basically, he saw every single stereotypical thing you might cram into a period piece drama about England during the Industrial Revolution. Crowded slums, ill-fed, filthy workers, men and women walking around with missing limbs, child labor, environmental degradation, grinding metal, choking black smoke, the works. Engels started writing articles and submitting them to various outlets, among them those Marx was working on in Paris. Pretty soon, Engels decided to collect and revise his notes and articles and ideas and turn them into a book that he called The Conditions of the Working Classes in England, which became his first contribution to mid-19th century socialism. Now in semi-regular correspondence with Marx, Engels swung through Paris on his way back to Germany so they could meet. And on August the 28th, 1844, they got together at a cafe near the Palais Royal. It was not technically the first time they had met, but it was the first time that they realized what kindred spirits they were. The two young men, both still in their mid-20s, got along famously, and Engels wound up staying at Marx's home for the next 10 days, the beginning of a lifelong collaboration and friendship. Marx, by this point, had begun thinking deeper and more seriously about the link between economics, society, and politics, and not just in the abstract. Marx was a man who dreamed of revolution, and he had hit upon this idea that the new industrial quote-unquote working class might just be miserable enough to be the engine of the next revolution. And when Engels came along with these horribly evocative descriptions of working class misery, they agreed with each other that they were really onto something, that they had discovered the revolutionary proletariat. Both Marx and Engels then got involved, at least peripherally, with a radical group of emigre German artisans who had formed themselves into something they called the League of the Just to promote socialist and anarchist philosophy and prepare for the very revolution Marx and Engels now believed was coming. The Marxes probably would have stayed in Paris indefinitely, or at least until the revolution came. But Prussian diplomats complained to the French government about radical German propaganda being produced in Paris, and in 1845 demanded that some of the more offensive elements be expelled from France, specifically citing this guy, Karl Marx. To his horror and dismay, Marx discovered he had 1 week to leave the country, and the order was signed personally by Francois Guizot, earning lifelong enmity from Marx, who then had to pack up his wife Jenny, who was pregnant again, and little Jenny and scoot over to Brussels to start over. Again. To keep himself free of the long arm of Prussian conservatism, about 6 months after arriving in Brussels, Marx renounced his citizenship.
You know, they say that AI is the future, but Apartments.com has been using apartmental intelligence for...
Their arrival in Brussels happened to coincide with the beginning of the Hungry 40s. The potato blight and harvest failures were going to send recessive shockwaves reverberating through every sector of the European economy. So the going was hard for the Marx family, and his son Edgar was born in February 1847 at a very difficult time both for his family and for families across Europe. In Brussels, Marx and Engels also reconnected on a more permanent basis, and they actively collaborated on various book ideas, some of which, like The Holy Family, were published at the time, while others, like The German Ideology, sat around in piles of paper until Soviet researchers put them out in the 1920s and 1930s. Most of these ideas, though, revolved around their various beefs with other German radicals and philosophers. Old friends and mentors became derided rivals as Marx and Engels moved decisively towards the idea that material economics was the basis of everything else, and if you disagreed, prepared to be skewered with a sarcastic and acidic pen. They broke with the young Hegelians, they attacked other socialist theorists as Philistines and heretics and reactionary pawns, who all either had things upside down, or, if they had things right side up, they advocated different means to the same ends. Now, Marx and Engels were not unique in this regard, and in return, they were attacked, derided and mocked just as hard and with just as much venom. But outside of these beefs, they continued to keep an eye out for the revolution. And in one of Marx's works from this period that only saw the light of day well after he was dead, he wrote that, quote, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. But when it came to changing the world, Marx was never a fan of Blanqui-style revolutionary vanguardism, and he wanted the working class movements to be out in the open, not secret, that their great power was in their great numbers. Let the ruling classes tremble. Exerting more intellectual force inside the League of the Just, Marx succeeded in getting them to make a strategic shift. In June of 1847, the League of the Just rebranded itself as the Communist League and then came out into the open. To attract members and announce their program, they commissioned Marx and Engels to draft a manifesto. Marx got to work using as his foundation a pamphlet Engels had written called Principles of Communism, which Marx then redrafted and reworked into what has gone down in history as the Communist Manifesto. Now, as I said in episode 8.1, the Communist Manifesto was
What's up, man?
Yo, what's poppin'?
Checking out this Mike Duncan's Revolutions, you know.
Oh, I've never heard of it. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Detailed, for sure.
Right. First time I listened to it, I was really surprised about how detailed he got into Marx and Engels and
Yeah.
very early history into the First International. But, why I thought it was important, because I wanted to cover this and then show, like, how this First International later developed into, like, kind of workers' parties being used by the oligarchs to overthrow countries. You know what I'm saying? Like, how did it develop to the Bolshevik Revolution? You know what I mean? I think he kind of breaks that down well. So,
Yeah, there's a huge instance in the Islamic world of this. Right? You'll see, like, they'll use a lot of communist revolutions to take over,
mhm.
And a lot of them claim that they're secular, but then they make certain alliances that prove that they're not
Right.
against certain groups of religious people and so on and so forth, and they're usually set up by international banks and stuff to go ahead and pull the plug on like a certain country, and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is that he was talking about how the critique of Marxism isn't anarchism, because they saw how authoritarian Marxism is, and that's why Alul gives such a sort of elegant critique of Marxism, right? Because he's looking at how the same thing that Hegel was trying to maximize, which is freedom and reason, actually becomes sort of destroyed by the Marxists, right? Who take this idea of the pseudo eschatology of progress, right, and sort of push it into the sort of transhumanist direction, like way beyond. So they take science and progress and they make it the head of the state, but that sort of is leading nowhere. Right, it's leading to a sort of as Marx says, his movement is a sort of international movement, right? So in this international movement, he wants to overthrow both religion and the family. So it's pretty interesting how he,
this is something like I think that people aren't. What they're going to break down at least is that these people went into this like as professional revolutionaries. Like, they jumped into this situation knowing that they were going to be paid by the oligarchs and set up by the oligarchs, just like we watched with Jerry Lena of like Trotsky being like set up by the Schiffs in New York and all this stuff. Like these guys have been training and studying the French Revolution, and it's even going back to Marx. You're reading like he, he kind of just covered it too. Is like Marx was studying the French Revolution. Like these people were studying revolutions and how to go about that, how to overthrow the monarchy, and even the way that they describe it, it's like the repressive czar. That's the framework of Marx. But Marx is really, if you read into it, and he's about to go into it too, is like, there's death of children. He's like, he's almost delusional how genius he sees himself, and he's starving out there, and he feels like he deserves, all the wealth in the world and all this stuff. And of course, it's like it's selling it to the people as like, yeah, we're this workers' party. It's going to help everybody and create this utopia. But when it's actually in practice, it's like, no, this is just a revolutionary that's going to, take as much resources as possible, and the oligarch wins in the end, and the people suffer because you're just draining the system by selling them a dream. That's really what it's all about. And he came up with the perfect way to sell that dream, and which is the economic theory. But it's like based on a lie anyways. You know what I'm saying? It's like based on like twisting, I don't know. It's snake-like, and he knows it.
Yeah, it said that, or it says here in 1814, upon Napoleon's, it says Heinrich Marx qualified as a lawyer in 1814, but upon Napoleon's 1815 defeat at Waterloo, the Rhineland came into conservative control of the Kingdom of Prussia. An 1812 edict, unenforced by the French, asserted that Jews could not occupy legal positions or state offices, and Prussian enforcement of the law led to trouble for Heinrich Marx. So this is basically Marx's father, right? Who they're saying he was a Protestant Christian, but there's good reasons why he would be a Protestant Christian in public, right? Is because he couldn't get a job otherwise, basically.
Yeah,
right?
it just covered it that they were Jews and that they had to mask themselves as Protestant Christians, and that his father was extremely obsessed with ideas from the Enlightenment and Voltaire. So
right.
Like Duncan.
Yeah, that's another thing I was gonna say is that Marx is basically, as you said, his family supported the French Revolution as a result. Absolutely. Right, of all these reforms taking place, because as you could see, it sort of directly affected their lives, right? So when he went with Schelling, right, as we looked at over there in I think it was Paul Stuthern who said he went with Schelling to go plant a tree of liberty in the marketplace. For the French Revolution. This is Hegel.
Great reason,
right?
Like worshiping reason. And it's
right.
so...
so Hegel supported the French Revolution even. Right.
Right.
So
well, they all looked at it like, they romanticized about it.
Right.
Loved that, but that's the same way with Lenin and Trotsky. Like all these guys romanticized about it, and like even during the Russian Revolution with Lenin and Trotsky, they're sending letters to the Grand Orient in France, exchanging notes on relations between the current quote Russian Revolution. It's not. It's the October Revolution. It's not Russian, really. You know what I mean? But it's Jewish. Yeah, you know what I mean? They're exchanging notes with the Grand Orient on how, the Illuminati actually, because if you read into that, it's like Jacobins and all this stuff going on in the fridge. I want to get into that too, because he covers that. But I think I'm going to go to Father Seraphim Rose and how he covers Nesta Webster and all that eventually. So...
yeah, it sounds like a lot of interesting material for sure. But in in Marxism as a sort of reaction to Hegelianism, right? Sort of Peter Singer said that the dialectic that Hegel sort of rolled out, which is affirmation, then negation of the affirmation, then a negation of the negation. Right? So how this works out in metaphysical domains, you have existence, then you have non-existence, and as a result, you have becoming, because becoming is sort of the synthesis between existence and non-existence, right? So, so in terms of Marx, right, he applied the dialectic to a historical sort of engine, right? So he said the dialectic is sort of the engine of progress in history, right? So he said it's the thing that's moving societies along, getting societies to overthrow their leadership, and then things even out, right? They reach an equilibrium of power, and then the rich get back on top, and the poor get back on the bottom, and then the poor overthrow the rich, and then it equals out again, right? And he sort of said this is a dialectical materialism that's pushing history, right? So Peter Singer sort of said that just as Hegel was metaphysical, Marx was deeply material, and that Marx's sort of dialectical response to Hegel was a completion of the dialectic itself, because the dialect was an abstract principle that was then brought into a material existence. And then you have Adorno, right, who goes batshit crazy and says actually it's negation that's driving the entire thing, that there's no affirmation of anything. The negation and then the negation of the negation are the true part of the dialectic. So there is no existence. There's no such thing that exists. So they go totally crazy. They go off the bridge with this Hegelian dialectic.
Right.
When you go to people like Peter Singer and Adorno, yeah.
Well, it's a kind of insanity first and foremost, and that's kind of pointed out in the Orthodox survival course, because at its root, it's these Enlightenment ideas sort of developing, as we were just talking about. It's like, it's coming from Voltaire. It's coming from kind of these sick people that are like, it's paganism gets its revenge on Christianity in the Renaissance, or this in the so-called Enlightenment, this period, and then it develops into Marx, and then it just goes into like straight absurdism, and there is no truth, and there's only material, and then we have to obtain utopia by technical means, and then this leads into transhumanism, because man sees no other, that from a Christian worldview. Like I think I've told you this before. It's like, progress ends at the cross. Really, there is no more progress from that point on in the Orthodox worldview. That's why it's like, the church doesn't change with the time. Whereas with these people that are obsessed with this, this so-called progress, they think they're developing into something. Well, I think that's what Marx was so obsessed with, because he had been at the bottom so long, right? So and he's rejecting God. So there's what do you get? He's talking about changing the world, but what does he really mean by changing the world? I don't know.
And then you have this looming idea that sort of comes in, that the ascension up the hierarchy of being, is really a movement, which is really the refinement of the spirit, and is sort of the goal of history, right? So you get this sort of, once you combine Hegel with the sort of millenarianist outlook, you get a sort of sort of utopian.
Right, because they're looking for this this 1,000-year reign.
Yeah, you get the theistic evolution. Exactly.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And what's interesting, I found a quote from Hitler, man, the other day, and he was basically saying that that they were the true Marxists, the Nazis were the true Marxists, and that and I thought that was really funny. Like,
well, it's never pure enough, right?
Yeah, well, that was something they were denying. They were like, well, H-Man wasn't a Marxist at all, blah 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 blah. And then I find this long quote, in his own words, him calling himself like a pure descendant of Marx. I was like, wow. Well, I mean, but that's really what it is, And Eustace Mullins says, which I really think is interesting. It's like he said, National Socialism, communism, and something else all came out of Frankfurt, Germany. You know, and well, I mean, if that's true, that and there's some connection between Marx and the Rothschild family. I don't know. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah, I think he was related to Lionel de Rothschild.
Right.
Who was like MP of Britain. I think it was like um the son or related to NM Rothschild or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, so they're pretty prominent. And also, I read a quote by Bakunin, right? Bakunin sort of complained that, Marx was funded by the Rothschilds. So whether this is true or not, it is interesting to hear him, state this.
I believe that. I absolutely believe that.
Right.
But in my research recently, I'm going to show you something real quick. Let me see it. I think this has a big major thing to do with what's going on with all this. So we got the revolutions here, but I'm about to present something else here. All right. Here. You ever looked into
Oh
this?
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. What? This is Hadrian put this down, or
Who? Who's Hadrian?
the Roman guy, or
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read it.
yeah, but I have seen. Yeah, but they thought this guy was the Messiah.
Correct.
So that's the problem with
like
with
another Sabbatai Zevi, or
they were looking for a military leader, a military style leader, and they didn't get one.
Right. They were looking for somebody to take over the land there. And that's like the obsession. That's been the obsession since that time. And that's the Rothschild obsession that, from this time period, that's been the development. And all revolutions are almost based on this first revolt right here, and even prior ones, I think. Like that's really what I think what the root of the revolutionary mindset is this.
Yeah, look at this. It says Kokbo was declared a Nasi, Nasi.
You see
Prince
that?
of Israel. What the fuck?
That's
Well, no. Nasi means Prince of Israel. Oh, that's gonna go over well in the Discord.
Right. Yeah. Explain this. But anyways, that's funny. The things you look at, but that studying my book, that kind of like came up because I'm trying to like connect this utopian idea and like throughout history, this kind of lawless spirit where going back to the Sanhedrin, what they expected, because from the Christian viewpoint, it's like there's this rejection of Christ at the Sanhedrin because they wanted this worldly Messiah that's going to dominate for them and make everybody else their slave. And it's not until they acquire this land that they can be the collective Israel. It's this very Kabbalistic mindset, right? But that goes back to those revolts. But these same revolts are influencing Marx. This same spirit has gone throughout history, and I think in the scriptures it's called the lawless spirit, because it's. But I mean, even Protestantism, it's a lawless spirit. You're rebelling against something. You're protesting something, and even up into the '60s and everything else, really. And in our times too, that 10 minutes, the lights go out in New York City, everybody's revolting and throwing bricks through windows. I mean, we're kind of in a lawless time. And I'm not saying it's just them, but I think that, it's clear from the scriptures we understood that from a Christian's perspective, the Sanhedrin were definitely influenced by Satan, and they had this very rebellious, they wanted a worldly kingdom, so they were revolting for that purpose. So it's not necessarily we could find instances where it's like you could have a righteous battle, but this seems like it's not over a righteous thing at all. It's over, a deluded so-called false messiah in this occasion where they thought he was going to, dominate for them, and it just didn't happen. Oh, look at it. Eusebius, a 4th century bishop and historian from Caesarea, offers a Christian interpretation of the role, framing the Christian suffering as divine punishment for the crucifixion of Jesus. Wow. That's pretty crazy. You see that? Oh, look. He says,
Yeah, it's tripped out.
Eusebius provides key details missing from Dio where he likely neither knew used as a source, such as Tinius Rufus as the Roman emperor of Judea, and identifying Bar Kokhba as the revolt leader and sitting Batar at the site of the final siege. Perspectives, geographical proximity, across the lost materials due to making this right important, albeit ideological filters such as the revolt. It's to the revolt. Rabbinic literature offers significant insight into Jewish communities' experience interpreted events, while these texts primarily focus on Jewish law. Were not intended as historical chronicles, they contain narrative sections that preserve stories, teachings, legal rulings, and reflects related to the period, though they're shaped by theological and didactic goals. Some of these traditions are connected to preserved historical memory. They stories about revolt, and those regarding the fall of Batar appear in Agadic material, particularly in the Babylonian Talmud. You see that what was it that I sent to you? I think it was you know what I'm about to go to?
But yeah, it's crazy. Like 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch. Like they just keep writing parts of the Bible. So how long were they doing that for? It says, meanwhile, the trauma of Jerusalem's destruction left profound mark on Jewish messianic and apocalyptic expectations, endured with works such as 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, expressing hopes that Rome would soon be overthrown. It's like, okay, but, what is Ezra still writing books?
Wait, so where are you reading that at? Are you reading that on this right here?
Yeah, the last sentence on the
Oh,
page.
okay. Meanwhile, the trauma of Jerusalem's destruction left a profound mark on Jewish thought. Messianic and apocalyptic expectation endured with works such as 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch expressed hopes that Rome would soon be overthrown by divine action. Wait. So now let's read 4 Ezra. Chapters 3 through 14 of the Great Book of 2 Ezra is Jewish Apocalypse, also sometimes known as 4 Ezra, or the Jewish Apocalypse of Ezra, and should not be confused with a later work called the Greek Apocalypse of Ezra. For it to be canonical, written during the Babylonian captivity, and calls it Isru Sotwell. It was often cited by the fathers of the church. In the Eastern Armenian tradition, it's called 3 Ezra. It was written in the late 1st century CE, following the destruction of the Second Temple. I've never read it. You want to read it? You want to see what it says?
It's kind of weird. Yeah, I've never heard of that for sure.
Yeah. Okay. It says, for Ezra consists of 7 visions of Ezra the scribe. The first vision takes place as Ezra is still in Babylon. He asks God how Israel can be kept in misery if God is just. The archangel Uriel is sent to answer the question, responding that God's ways cannot be understood by the human mind. Soon, however, the end would come and God's justice would be made manifest. Similarly, in the second vision, Ezra asks why Israel was delivered by the Babylonians and is again told that man cannot understand this and that the end is near. In the third vision, Ezra asks why Israel does not possess the world. Uriel responds that the current state is a period of transition. Here follows a description of the fate of evildoers and the numerous. Ezra asks whether righteous may intercede for the unrighteous on the judgment day, but what is told that the judgment day is final. The next 3 visions are more subtle in nature. The fourth is a woman mourning for her only son. She is transformed into a city when she hears the desolation of Zion. Uriel says that the woman is a symbol of Zion. The fifth vision concerns an eagle with 3 heads and 20 wings and 12 large wings and 8 smaller wings, quote, over against them. The eagle is rebuked by a lion and then burned. The explanation of this vision is that the eagle refers to the 4th kingdom of the vision of Daniel, and the wings and the heads as the rulers. The final scene is the triumph of the Messiah over the empire. The 6th vision is of a man representing the Messiah who breathes fire on a crowd that is attacking him. This man then turns to another peaceful multitude which accepts him. Finally, a vision of a restoration of scriptures related. God appears to Ezra in a bush and commands him to restore the law. Ezra gathers 5 scribes and begins to dictate. After 40 days, he has produced 204 books, including 70 works to be published last, 2 Esdras 14 and 44. And in 40 days they wrote 204 books, and it came to pass when the 40 days were filled with the highest spake, saying that the first that thou hast written published only that the worthy and unworthy be read, and keep the 70 last that thou mayest deliver them only to such as be wise among the people. This is kind of interesting. The 70 might refer to the Septuagint and most of the Apocrypha and the lost books that are scribed in the Bible. It is more probable that the number is just symbolic. Almost all the Latin editions of the text are large Lucana, 70 verses. I'm missing them and trace their common origin. One are the manuscript Codex Saint Germanus or something like that. I don't know. See if I can present this. Really, no.
What'd you say?
Prove he was the Messiah or converted to Islam. So he converted to Islam and they became known as the Donma, which means to turn, but they didn't turn. And then the next century along came Jacob Frank, and Jacob Frank took Sabbateanism on to another level of evil. He claimed that he was a reincarnation of Zevi, and he moved forward with this whole concept of the Donma, where you appear to be something like a Judaism or Roman Catholicism or whatever. Well, actually, you are this Sabbatean Frankist cult, and you manipulate or have yourself manipulated into positions of power in these different religions and different cultures. But actually, you're representing this Sabbatean cult all along. And the Rothschilds are Sabbateans. Sabbatean Frankists, and funnily enough, you had this connection between Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who basically started the Rothschild dynasty. You had Adam Weishaupt, this Jesuit educated Jewish guy, and they created the Bavarian Illuminati in 1776. What a lot of history doesn't include is that the third person in that trinity that created that Illuminati was Jacob Frank, who was a friend and associate of Mayor Amschel Rothschild. And Frank moved in on the Roman Catholic Church and basically took that over. It was the Sabbatean Rothschilds and Sabbateans in general that created modern Israel.
Them Sabbateans are out there, man. I gotta watch out for them. You know any Sabbateans? Any Sabbateans out in the audience?
Well, I think it's evolved
Yeah.
right into accelerationism. Right, so there's a sort of philosophical version of sort of Sabbateanism and the holiness of sin, causing sin to bring about some result. In other words, sort of LARPing as a sinner, LARPing as a religious person, all at the same time.
Well, I read something about Sabbateans that they had, they considered that, the more that you sin, the closer that you would get to salvation in some way, or that would save you. The salvation through sin. That's pretty crazy.
Right, and Jacob Frank also said you got to burn the Torah. You got to burn the Torah. And keep the Zohar. Yeah, I almost said Tohar, but yeah, burn the Torah, keep the Zohar. Man. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, they're very secretive about it because externally they'll tell you like, we're all about peace and, but then every now and then, you'll find little strange things that they'll teach, and then they'll talk about Lucifer kind of in a positive light, and then in behind closed doors, these types, because I've been around Templars that were involved with, Frankism, supposedly, something, but they're very secret about it. They don't want their cult members that are closely aligned with them to know that they're as evil as they actually are.
Well, that's the thing is that certain Sethians and certain like Albigensians and stuff, they all had a similar sort of protocol. Right? They had this idea that when you have sacred rites, you should like sort of, invert them. Right? So that's why when you do the Sethian worship or whatever, you do all the things you're not supposed to do, right?
Yeah, it's a trip, man. Definitely.
Yeah, so they had these like sort of cults, like obviously Jacob Frank, who is a Sabbatean, right? He had like orgies and stuff. So like this is the kind of stuff they were into, but what I'm trying to get across is there are certain Jewish sects of antinomians and Gnostics,
right,
like in the Second Temple and also all these crazy Gnostic groups that Saint Irenaeus talks about. And some of them had like females, some of them were doing like weird rituals, like they're doing pagan stuff, like all sorts of stuff.
So what text is that from Saint Irenaeus? Let's go to it. Let's just go look at it for a second. Why not? I can bring it up. I'm kind of excited because I got my
Yeah, I don't know if he's got like stuff on the Sethians, the Ophites, and stuff.
Let's see what Saint Irenaeus has to say. You know who else? Kind of Saint Augustine has some good stuff as well.
Right, because he's writing about the Manichaeans, and And there's obviously a bunch of sects, and the Manichaeanism sort of led to the Albigensians, and the Cathari. So there's wild sort of Manichaean sects where they would do weird rituals and obviously, if people don't know, like Manichaeanism, that St. Augustine talked about, sort of like an offshoot of Gnosticism and Zoroastrianism. So it's combined.
Hold up. I got something. Hold up. Here we go.
When Irenaeus was appointed by the Christians in Lyons to be their church's bishop or overseer, he had at least 3 enormous tasks in front of him. 1. Many families in his congregation were grieving the losses of nearly 50 martyrs from the previous year. 2. The gospel needed to be spread into the region surrounding Lyons, where people were polytheists or atheists, or the Christians needed their local churches to be organized. 3. There were discussions and disagreements between Eastern and Western Christians regarding how to respond to heretical groups claiming to be Christians, who were seeking to gain converts away from the universal church. Among the heretical groups who were falsely identifying as Christians were those later referred to as Gnostics. The word Gnostic derives from the Greek word gnosis, which translates in the English to knowledge. Although the Gnostics were not a single group, they did share some general theological tendencies. Irenaeus believed the Gnostics presented a serious threat to the correct presentation of the gospel and to the unity of the universal church. He therefore collected as many Gnostic writings as he could find and wrote a detailed exposé of Gnostic beliefs and behavior. The full title of Irenaeus's exposé is A Refutation and Subversion of Knowledge Falsely So Called, but in time Christian scholars have shortened the title to Against Heresies. It was written sometime between...
I like the original title, actually. What was it? It was like, it was pretty long. Hold on. He said what? That was kind of cool. A refutation and subversion of knowledge falsely so called. That's kind of wild.
But in time, Christian scholars have shortened the title to Against Heresies. It was written sometime between AD 182 and 186, and is considered to be the best description of Gnosticism from the early church era. Against Heresies is organized into 5 distinct books. The first book is an exposition of the beliefs and behavior of various Gnostic groups. Of the Gnostics, Irenaeus wrote, "These men falsify the teachings of God and prove themselves to be evil interpreters of the good word of revelation. They also overthrow the faith of many by drawing them away under the pretense of superior knowledge." Modern literary scholars would classify ancient Gnostic literature as fantasies. Gnostic teachers created very elaborate explanations of divine beings known as eons, and how the eons brought into being all non-physical and physical reality in the universe. Gnostics taught that the eons wished to know their origin from their original eon, variously named Proarche, Propator, and Bythus, who had a female counterpart named Enea, also known as Charis or Sige. The main branch of Gnostics Irenaeus exposed were the Valentinians. The Valentinians taught that there were 30 eons existing in pairs who reproduced successive pairs of male and female eons. The last of them was Sophia, or knowledge, who broke with tradition of ignorance and passionately desired to know the original eon. Eventually, a being known as the Demiurge, who emanated from Sophia, erred greatly by creating the physical universe. Gnostics identified this foolish demiurge as the creator god of the Old Testament. A common Christianization of Gnosticism was to portray the God of the Old Testament as evil and Jesus and his Father as good and wise beings who were trying to rescue the people from the world of their physical natures. Salvation, according to the Gnostics, was the enlightenment one gains by learning the elaborate names and stories behind their beliefs. The enlightenment would allow people to escape the physical world and join a purely spiritual.
There's like name worshippers, right? And like they pose as Orthodox Christians, and they kind of say like, I think I've talked to you about it before, but they kind of say that the names of God are God Himself, right? And it like the name of God is God Himself, and it's like names are created letters, right? Like language is a created thing.
Yeah, like to Valentinus, right, and his students, right, and also in the Haggadah, they have a sort of divine revelation of language in the form of the letters.
Right.
So they say like the letters like were like with God, they're like sort of spoke to God pretty much, you know, or like God speaks through them.
Too?
So what was that?
The Sefer Yetzirah, it's like I think it's
Right.
that too.
Right.
So I said.
Right. It's like the divine name, the divine language. And it's sort of like pretty much like Pythagorean in the sense that like there's these divine laws or these divine like math or something like that.
Right.
Know, that's
letters correspond to numbers, and then these sequences somehow like can be related to how these divine sparks kind of or
right
came down from God, like his footstool or something. I don't remember how. Like I've heard it before, but in a few different ways, because there's modernized versions of it as well, right? Like this kind of same type of story, But it's interesting. It's interesting that I'm always surprised, how early this stuff is in the history of the church, like with Irenaeus, like how early he was writing like 5 books on this. You know what I mean? It's wild.
Realm where they would be reconnected with the original eon. Irenaeus did not just expose the overcomplicated Valentinian teachings, though. He described the beliefs of other Gnostic groups, whose names and stories were different from the Valentinians. Most of the groups were nameless, but Irenaeus also exposed the teachings of Gnostics named Secundus, Epiphanes, Ptolemy, Marcus, Simon the Magician from Acts 8, Saturninus, Basilides, Carpocrates, Marcellina, Cerinthus, the Ebionites, the Nicolaitans from Revelation 2, 6 and 15, Cerdo, Marcion, and the Encratites. Irenaeus hoped by exposing the mutually inconsistent opinions of the Gnostics to persuade anyone from being seduced by their teaching. If the mere exposure of the confusing overcomplexity in Book 1 did not persuade Irenaeus's readers to avoid Gnostic teaching, Book 2 provided an argument that the Gnostics used poor logic to arrive at their conclusions. For example, the very idea of polytheism, or there being multiple gods, is absurd. For if neither of two gods are perfect, then there must be a reality or God greater than they are. Likewise, if angels created the world apart from the will of the greatest eon, then the greatest eon is not really that good, wise, or careful. Irenaeus also pointed out that the teachings of the Gnostics were inconsistent with the rule of faith, which was the consistent and comprehensive teaching about the Trinity, creation, salvation, and other doctrines. Shifting the burden of proof to the Gnostics, he exposes the emptiness of their system, showing that they copied their ideas from pre-existing stories, but just changed the names. They also made extensive use of math to show that numbers which could be added together to arrive at 30 were proof enough that there were 30 eons. One of the chief theological contributions of Irenaeus in his Against Heresies was his doctrine of the atonement, called the recapitulation theory. The recapitulation theory suggests that all parts of Jesus' life on the earth, including any physical suffering he endured, are indispensable to the salvation of other human beings. The recapitulation theory emphasizes God's role as the redeemer of creation, not one who merely wanted to help the spirits imprisoned inside people's flesh to escape. The second book concludes with a refutation of the absurdity of the migration of souls where people might spiritually transfer from one form to another. Finally, books 3, 4, and 5 investigate specific passages of Scripture to demonstrate Gnosticism's broad and deep contradictions with a historical understanding of Scripture. Throughout the work, Irenaeus shows how faulty the interpretations of Scripture by the Gnostics are. No sane scholar would read a piece of literature like the Gnostics read the Scriptures. However, in the final 3 books, Irenaeus reminds his readers of passages in every section of the Scriptures and in which ways the passages contradict the most prominent claims of Gnostic theology. By the end of the 5th book, Irenaeus has well demonstrated that the historical events portrayed by the Scriptures, especially physical creation and the physical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, are essential to a proper understanding of the truth, Christianity, and God himself. Irenaeus engages in a negative apologetic, or defense of the faith, when he dismantles the heretical claims of the Gnostics, but he also engages in a positive apologetic when he gives biblical evidence for specific features of God and salvation that directly contradict Gnostic claims. In the end, based on the Scriptures and the consistent teaching of the Church handed down from Jesus through clear lines of apostles and their disciples, the truth of the gospel can be and is clearly known by the Church around the world. Irenaeus not only exposed the fallacies of Gnosticism in his chief work Against Heresies, but he used ideas and language that later theologians would use and develop as they formulated their own theological expressions in writings, creeds, and liturgical formulae.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, Marcion and the Ebionites, they're kind of different from the Gnostics in that they don't really believe in like the Sophia and all that type of stuff, right?
Right.
But Marcion did sort of believe that like basically like Paul and the New Testament is good and the Old Testament is bad.
Right. And he
Yeah,
thought
so-
he felt like that wasn't the same God, right? That the Old
Right, so-
Testament wasn't
yeah.
the same God.
Right.
Which-
he said he said it's a different God, whereas the Gnostics, they said it's basically the demiurge.
You know what
doing
it
all
is?
that until Jesus.
You know what it is, like people really don't understand is for instance, like when you're dealing with the Old Testament, a lot of times, and you're dealing with God in the Old Testament, you're dealing with an unruly people a lot of time. When you know what I mean? So when they're like, oh, he's mean or something like that, it's like, well, I don't know. He did tell them like 20 different times not to do this, and then they go and do it, and then Moses is up there, receiving revelation. He comes back down, they're already worshiping a golden calf. You know what I mean? It's like, it's kind of hard to say, like, it's not justified. I mean, it's impossible to say it's not justified. It's God. I mean, I think the biggest mistake a lot of people go into the Scripture, and I think I made this mistake when I was younger too, because I was just kind of prideful, I think. It's like kind of going into the Scriptures thinking like, you're in a position of judging God. It's like, no, God's the judge, right? And it's like each man has to be, we're going to have to face God. It's not you that judges God, or rather God's the judge. And if we go into anything in the Scriptures looking at it the other way around, we misplace our own selves, and that's a misplaced judgment off the top, I think. So some would see that as kind of like just like a blind obedient type thing. I don't see it that way. Just Because anytime I feel like, especially in the scriptures, that God is telling the people to do something, it's not like, he's trying to be this dictator with it or something. It's for their own good. And every time they don't do it, that's when, disaster strikes, you know. And sometimes it's just because we're in a fallen world, and disaster happens in a fallen world. It's not necessarily a judgment. So what's been on your mind lately, man? What have you been thinking about?
Nothing really. Try to keep the old, storehouse clean there. But yeah.
How's your show been going, man? I haven't been tuning
It's
in
okay.
because I've been a little like busy lately. I've just finally gotten some time to chill out.
Not a thing has changed. Not a
I
damn
wouldn't
thing has
think
changed.
so. I wouldn't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, not anything has changed. Just more, basically pointed discussions. Right. So, as you've probably seen, I've been trying to sort of clean house to sort of make sure people stay on the topics and stuff.
Good.
And so,
Good.
yeah, I mean, most of my shows just basically just 6 hours of cold hard discussion until people show up. Then I let them talk. Right.
Right.
I'll let them talk, especially if it's like 3 or 4 people. I'll just go ahead and just let them talk. But
Yeah. Well,
most of the time, there's not 4 people on the panel, so it's just like 3 people usually, and 2 of them are pretty silent. Yeah. So we just sort of present like we've been going over the pre-Socratics.
oh yeah.
So.
I seen you say something the other day. It was like, we're the most shadow banned channel on the internet. We don't even
Just the group, the entire group. Like, you got DK.
You're right. I think you're right about that. Not just the channel, but as a group, I believe that is
Right. They funneled us into one group. It seems like
yeah,
kind of weird.
Yeah.
Because there's a bunch of weird people that have a bunch of different ideas, but none of them seem to have, the one, sort of common denominator is they can't seem to pop off, right? Despite the fact that they have talent, they have comparable material, right? So,
Hey, so I got a question for you. So did you watch the Rogan episode with the,
no, I'm afraid not. Yeah.
well, I seen a clip from it, and it's like a channel. It was like it was a channel that was on YouTube Shorts, right? And it was for Andrew Wilson, and this channel was like, he said what everybody feared to say or something, was scared to say or something. It was like really weird like that. And then it went into the clip, and then it was like, Andrew Wilson just like downing on Don Lemon. You know what I mean? Yeah, he was just this token black dude that people listened to because he was woke or something like that. Like that was his take. And Joe Rogan's like, yeah, definitely. Like, oh, everybody says that about Don Lemon. What are we talking about? But I don't know. It's kind of weird that I'm not hating on the guy. It is what it is. He's there, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, like how like Jim Bob, like Andrew, like all these people, like they sort of just toe the line, like Jay Dyers of the world. You sort of expect a lot from them. Granted that they have sort of, opinions about conservatism, and now they're sort of just support the status quo. So it's really sad when, there's almost no opposition, that the lowest of the low are the people that they have us encircle and attack, and even they get, really get put on.
Well, what I don't understand is like, you have all these episodes about the New Age movement. You have you're talking about the New World Order, and you're talking about Blavatsky, and you talk about all these topics. But then when it comes down to it, how could you in one breath talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance, right? And then turn around and be in communion with people with a church established by Stalin. Like, it doesn't make sense at its root, right? And in the same sense that, you can cover something like the New Age movement, but then be associated with people that are like heading towards a more New Age modernist, turning Orthodoxy into a New Age movement. And, Freemasonry's having such an influence with the magazines titled the New Age movement, and, churches getting paid by UNESCO, and, how, like people have been saying all those type of connections are going on, where it's like it almost feels like the subjects are getting covered almost to cover their tracks rather than to actually like sincerely cover the subject. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the recent thing where they had sort of 5 million subscriber YouTube channel do an attack video on them, and they went back and forth with this guy. So I think it's gay ops. I think these people are being promoted by the media, most likely. Because how would they get gay ops with like the top, 5 million subscriber channel, and then just like 2 days after, Jim Bob was doing a celebration video for 30K subscribers. So it's like when you get attacked or mentioned by these huge channels, it's part of a media sort of game where they're sort of ushering you in, and right, just like Nick Fuentes, right? So
absolutely, and all it is drama. Like, they sell drama and they sell fights and they sell, that's what sells in that realm. Rat beef, you know what I mean? Really, if you think about it, it's like selling rat beef. And they understand that well. That's why there's so many, like, there's so much crossover between I guess political commentators and celebrity, right? That's just what it is. It's a fake world, really. And no, none of those. I mean, and granted, with Wilson in the clip, he's making the point that all these media personalities have nothing to say. Well, I think Wilson knows just as well as anybody else once you get inside the company, you have no choice but to push the agenda that the company wants. And Tucker's a good example of that. He says, when he was working with these people, they had to push him all kinds of things. Now he's pushing these other things. But that sketches me out, because anytime you got a guy that was willingly pushing like these false narratives, and now he's pushing all these narratives that seemingly to expose the conspiracy, it's very Jones-esque. It's very controlled opposition. It has a controlled opposition feeling towards it. You know what I mean? And as far as the conservative movement is concerned, it's like it's getting directed towards Zionism. And if it's not, it's neo-Trotskyite or both. It's like something weird's going on there in the conservative movement in the United States. It's being obfuscated. But, I don't know. It all feels kind of pointless politically lately between all this infighting and what's going on until, I think Eustace Mons made the biggest point. It's like until that Federal Reserve Bank gets out of the way, the left and right paradigm isn't really serious, right? And it's only to like manipulate you so you don't focus on the fact that you have these kind of like, gnarly banking cartels running your government, really.
Well, that's the thing, is like before the entire scheme where like these guys were, put in support of the the major media talking points, and I'm talking about people with 200,000 or less subscribers on YouTube. Right. They're totally put in service of major media talking points for some reason, right? So then you're forced to think, did they get talking points from the media, or then are they just so psyoped, that they'll just repeat the talking points from the media either to
Well, that's
get on the main channel or
goal, isn't it? It's the goal is to like convert everybody to the hive mind, right? So you wouldn't know anyways who's being paid and who's not, because everybody's like, once the status quo is out there, then everybody's got to comply. And if you don't comply, then you're ostracized in that world. And it's you pick a side, and they want everything very black and white, so you fall into the dialectic, right? But that's always been the plan, and they've gotten it down so well now. You know, people don't realize this. Like whole idea of political parties comes out of the Masonic Lodge. It's like once a left wing Mason, is finished, a right wing Mason takes over. That's really what's going on here, and unfortunately, people are so naive they don't see it. That these people, just like the Bolsheviks, they were more worried about the oligarchs. They didn't care about a communist workers party for the rights of the people. Like, they weren't freeing anybody. In the same way that the Republican Party really doesn't care about the middle class, or just like maybe there's a couple people there that are idealistic enough to really hope, but I mean those people are rooted out, attacked, and punished for those type of things. I think the majority of people are in it for donorship, and that's why so many people are getting paid from, you know, for what is it? The Israeli foreign whatever. You know what I mean? Those donors and stuff. I don't know.
It's IFCJ or something like that. International Fellowship of Christians and Jews or something.
Well, I was talking about there's Zionist APAC. Is that what it's called? Yes.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so that was what I was talking about. It's just like, all these Congress people and politicians getting paid off by Zionist organizations, And now it's to the point where there's women talking. I watched this Zionist woman talking about, she was going to make sure anybody that spoke out against Israel couldn't get a job or have a relationship. She'd ruin their life. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how these people are talking about. And it's antichrist in nature. It's going back all the way back to that Bocarba revolt and the French Revolution and Marx and all this stuff. That's really what it's all about. It's like the Zionist movement is all that. This is the culmination of an antichrist movement that's developed. It's like festered at this point. Now that the monster was buried over time to this point, now it's grown, and we're dealing with this ungodly, lawless, reality we're in. And it's unfortunate for a lot of people. I think, with this Epstein stuff, I think, what was in the dark is finally coming to light. And what 10 years ago would have called you insane and sent to a mental institution, now it's being attested to. And it's like, this is real. This is what's happening. These people are really out here, and they're really talking like that. He's talking about, it sounded like you were reading the Protocols of Zion, a lot of that. I mean, the emails, am I tripping, or, guys are recommending Dugan to him, and,
right.
He's with Putin. He's got a membership to Chabad. He's paying for one of their schools for this messianic cult that's, accelerationist. Right? It's insane, man.
Right. He's friends with like a French lady who's like a Rothschild. It's just like,
right. And she's like talking about how, like, the Rothschilds were behind Hitler. And did you see that shit?
Yeah, it's weird.
Man, it's psycho, man.
I was arguing with them in the Discord about that.
Oh, I'm sure that really pissed them off. That's pretty funny. I'm sure that made somebody mad. Well, it should, man. I mean, come on.
Well, they added you. They said, when is Unseen Warfare going to address this?
What am I supposed to address? They're the ones supposed to address it. They're supposed to address that one, man. I mean, we got it out of the horse's mouth. One of the Rothschilds is out here admitting to, backing Hitler, man. So what do you want me to say? I told you so. That now they need to address it. But what are they? I mean, come on. Now I know what they're gonna say. A Jew said it. That's that's like the default, And that's the big confusion. I don't think people get it. Like a Christian perspective is like, we don't hate Jews, we don't hate communists. We want them to come towards the truth. We don't like their actions. You don't have to like a person's actions. You can hate a person's actions and not necessarily hate them and the ideology. And and that's not to say like, I've read some things where it was like maybe there was some sincerity there to some degree, but I really can't see it. I think that like all politicians, Hitler was, he sold a dream to the people. They thought he was going to be the savior against the Bolsheviks and the communists. In reality, he was one himself. And that's documented. He was under a Kurt Eisner. He was going to a communist funeral. He was in communist getup. He admitted to being largely influenced by Marx. With National Socialism, it's just it's supplanting the economic aspect that the Bolsheviks focus on with the race, really. And it's just two sides to the same coin. And when he died, he gave over his blessing to the Soviets and said the other part of the Eastern power should win, because he hated the United States and he hated Europe, and he thought they were weak and feminine, and he was embarrassed that he was beat by them. That's what he said. So he thought that of course Stalin should win or should take over the world in some way. And that was supposedly what he said. But I really don't buy it. I think they were all in on it in some way. I really do. There's something to do with the Thule Society and this, you can look into it. There was swastikas seen on the rubles of the provisional government of the Freemasonic government that took over the government in Russia from the Tsar. There's a Sisson document that talks about a unity between the Germans and the Bolsheviks, and the Germans were helping the Bolsheviks. Lindendorf admitted to it. Then there was the Stalin Nazi pact. You know what I mean? Like all throughout that time, they had pacts with these people. If you really hated these people, why are you in communion with the Zionist? You know what I mean? But the reality was they wanted to kill as many non-Zionists because they had the same goal. And the Zionists were looking for a scapegoat anyways, because you could be perpetually the victim, right? And to this day, but Muse Mullins said something really funny, and people might get scandalized, but they said, maybe they should build a statue to Hitler in Israel. And the reason they said that is because the reason he said that is because without him, there wouldn't have been this taking over from the Palestinians, this whole Balfour, this whole thing. It would have never happened to fruition in the full capacity that it did.
Yeah, it's kind of messed up. But if you look at like a lot of the sort of ideas that like Hitler and Stalin had, I think ideologically they're very similar. Like they had like a distrust in like democracy. They were going to use like a sort of conservative social conscience in order to guide the masses.
Right.
You know, they both believed in industrialism and making that the central place of government. So I mean, just in the style of government that they had, you know, it was like vastly similar. You know,
Right,
so I
man.
mean, between them, I mean, between the styles of government that they implemented, there's not really that much difference in the power that's being expressed. So
Right. And I think the reality of it is, and this is something that Mullen said, is that, like the Solder Commandos, they were Zionists. Nobody wants to talk about that. There was what's really interesting, and I'm not saying that I could prove this or not, but there's stories of, in Russia's catacomb saints of men getting like gold poured down their throats, right? Well, then at the Nuremberg trials, then there was also documentation of the same thing. Well, what some people seem to thought was that maybe some of those bodies that were being killed were actually the Bolsheviks killing Christians, and they were counting it as Nazis killing Jews. You understand what I'm saying? Because that was what's going on as well. I'm not saying that the Jews weren't being killed, because they were, but I'm saying in some cases they could have been counting Christians as Jews because they just didn't care at that point. I feel like it was very, I don't know. And the big cover up, it's like, why is the, I grant the 6 million. A lot of people don't grant the 6 million. I grant the 6 million. I say he did it. I say they did it, right? But I say that it was, why is the focus on the 6 million when there was 100 million Russians, right? What's up with that? So a majority Jewish population can kill 100 million Russians, Ukrainian, Slavic people, and then the Western world is only focused on this 6 million, and that just seems like a scapegoat to me. Especially when you had Zionists involved with the Nazis. That's the very strange thing. And I'm not a Nazi supporter whatsoever. I'm really not. I don't like Hitler. I believe he was Antichrist. He was very religion, as far as Christianity is concerned. I know that he had a copy of the Secret Doctrine. I know that Stalin and the communists had a copy of the Secret Doctrine that they were very obsessed with. He had a copy he was obsessed with. They were supposedly, he had some weird belief. This was what Michael Hoffman talks about, where he wouldn't give his soldiers and generals any weapons, because he felt that they should will it, that they were superhuman in some sense because they were German, the chosen people, so they should will it because they had some kind of magical power or some sense because of this occult book that he had read. And he has outlines in this occult book, and Michael Hoffman covers that in his book, Adolf Hitler, the Enemy of the German People. It's worth a read. I highly recommend it, because it's a kind of often overlooked point, but there's documented things where generals were ordering like ammunition and food and different things, and they weren't getting it. The men just weren't getting it because they were being told that they had to will it because there was some mystical thought going on. And I think that developed out of the Thule Society, right? And a lot of people don't understand this. It's like, well, why did the Nazis get rid of Freemasonry? It's because, first of all, the Thule Society was its own version of Freemasonry. It was closely aligned with like Memphis Miserium, which isn't normally, it's like Egyptian based rather than Jewish, I believe, in some sense, where they view the Kabbalah coming from Egypt. That's what the Thule Society kind of was about. And, I feel like once the Nazis get into the position, just like, kind of like Alice Bailey or something like this, there's the externalization of the hierarchy, or Blavatsky's the same way. So there's no more need of the liberal lodges of Freemasonry if you're worried about those people, like, overtaking you in some way. Prior to this, Freemasonry, if we're looking at it from in the sense of like with the Bolsheviks or with the the French Revolution, if the monarch's in power, then the Freemason wants to overthrow, because they're perpetually in revolution. They're revolutionaries, really. That's what Freemasonry is all about. That's why they were behind the French Revolution and the Russian. But anyways, so but once they get into power, of course they don't want other secret societies around, because they know that they're going to try to, if they piss those people off, they're going to revolt. But this was what was interesting with the Bolsheviks. I found out the Bolsheviks pretended to persecute the Masons in Russia and bring them to court, and said that they killed the Tsar. They said this in the newspapers, and that they said that they were going to be murdered or sent to the prisons or something like that. Well, neither of that happened, and there's documentation on this that's in Oleg Plantanov's Secret History of the something Secret History of Russia or something like that, Volume 7. But he talks about that the Bolsheviks would persecute the so-called persecute the Freemasons, so the public wouldn't actually know that there was a connection between them. And the entire time, like, they had helped Kerensky get to the Grand Orient of France, and they were exchanging money and material on the revolution. It was really very close relationship between the Bolsheviks and the Freemasons, and many of the Bolsheviks were Freemasons.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, Marx was a Freemason. You know, we were talking about Marx earlier. Right? It seemed like he was part of a Masonic organization called League of the Just, and you know, their whole, goal was the creation of the New Jerusalem. They openly said that. They said we got to bring the kingdom of God on earth, and so on and so forth, which is basically like
that was the Nazi belief too. But then they combined it with the Chiliastic belief.
Right. And that's something that people don't get about. Like, they weren't just trying to make it for the German people. They wanted a new world order just as much as the Marxists did.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the problem. It's like, yeah, you could, because people don't understand what Reich actually means.
Right.
It means that you're empire.
Right.
That's like a sort of a world stage empire.
Absolutely.
Right. So like the entire idea is embedded within this, Rome, and being an empire, and
what Don Marquis said. I know this guy. I read this guy Don Marquis. He kind of covers like New World Order stuff. That what he said was that why was the question was asked, why would America fund the Germans all this money? Like these Jewish bankers fund Germany all this money, and then it would fall within this short time period. And the response from Don Marquis is because they were training for a globalist or a one world order, dictatorship. Like this was like a practice run, right? And the same with Stalin, and the same we see today with Putin, and the same we see even today in the United States in a lot of ways. We have this shadow kind of government going on, and I don't know. So true.
Yeah, I kind of put it in like there's two different modes, right? There's individualism and collectivism, but there's also like internationalism and nationalism. But what they want is the same thing, right? Because the goal of internationalism is basically to bring, right, all countries into the same order, right? And then the goal of nationalism is to bring all countries under the order of one nation, right? So then it's like, so nationalism is basically internationalism, because what they want is a sort of archaic return, right? Like Mussolini wanted to be Rome, right? Like, Hitler wanted to bring back the Reich,
right?
And so on and so forth. So they wanted to bring back this, kingdom, just like the Jews did, right? The Jews have a sort of philosophy and a theology of national restoration as well.
Absolutely.
Where their country was an international force.
Right.
And
even now, what they see it is they're building the Solomon's temple, right? It's like that's the goal of the Mason, that's the goal of the Jew, because they have a common goal. And I believe like Benaiah Barith sits at the top of that goal, and that's why you have these accelerationists, even with the with Shabbat, I think it's like they're pursuing their Messiah, and that Messiah, from my worldview, that's Antichrist, and that's going to be set up in Jerusalem. They're going to rebuild this temple, and the world's going to come to bow at this temple, and there's going to be Orthodox people. People were told maybe that will even think that they can bow to Antichrist and just keep their orthodoxy. That's what he'll offer.
Oh yeah.
He'll offer people that you could keep your religion as long as you bow to me. I think that's the whole delusion of it all.
Yeah, I predict 99% of Jews, Muslims, Christians are going to fall into it for sure.
Right, and see, one of the catacomb saints said something really interesting about the mark of the beast. He said the mark on the right hand represents the actions, because the man's hands are his actions, right? So the actions will be aligned with Antichrist, right? But the mind won't. So the mind will think that you can be a Christian, but by your actions, you'll be following and bowing to Antichrist. And he related that with Sergius bowing to the communist government, that you can keep your church as long as you bow to us, the communists, the Bolsheviks. You can bow to these people and keep your church as long as you follow them and their joys and your sorrows. This was Sergianism. So this is taking the mark on the hand. Now, taking it on the forehead is accepting it full on. The theology of Antichrist, the belief, the dogmas of Antichrist, you're accepting them mentally. That's taking the mark. In a lot of ways, I think.
Oh yeah, dude. Most people, they're basically say, I can't live without my Nibiru app.
Right.
And I just made up an app, but they're gonna make an app called Nibiru.
I thought about this. So
thing.
Imagine this. I think this is really interesting. So in the case of a catacomb saint, right, and viewing the Soviet, okay, so let's say you had a KGB priest, right, and the KGB priest baptizes you, and then at the end of the baptism, the KGB priest takes holy oil and he marks your head with it. You're telling me that's not an unholy mark? I think that's a type of the mark as well. It's like accepting chrismation from an unholy KGB agent or a Freemason in a cassock, or bowing to a patriarch in this way. That's in essence accepting the mark. I think there's many ways man accepts types of the mark, but these are I think those kind of patristic texts are like going to be leading up to a final mark. And a lot of times people think of it only in terms of material. They don't think of a spiritual mark a lot of times. I think they only think in terms of, it's going to be an RFID chip or something like this. I think we need to really be thinking more spiritually.
Right, especially when they have the means to put that type of technology in you, and nobody would even know that they put it inside you. So, so there's no physical chip anymore. Right, it's a whole confluence of things. They could just use a gel, nano gel, or whatever, and and it'll reassemble inside of your body. So this is the thing, is like, you don't even need physical chip anymore. So
what
that's
I thought was really interesting is this whole concept of okay, so what was it? What about the mark that was so interesting? Well, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's all good. You're talking about the mark of the beast.
Yeah, I know it. So what was it? I can't really remember what I was gonna say. But yeah, there's been multiple times I've kind of looked into this subject to try to figure out exactly what it is. You know what I mean? And I think that there is aspects of it where if someone were to accept something like, putting some technology in your hand or something in your right hand, then that doesn't seem good. And it does talk about not being able to buy or sell. But I think in a lot of ways,
yeah, But they have like what they call non-surgical implants
Right.
now. So all you need is the nanos,
Mhm.
right? So, and you can ingest them, you can inject them, right? So, so this is the thing: is like, anytime you go to the hospital and pass out for 2 hours, you could have had this done to you. You know what I'm saying, right? So it's just like,
Absolutely. You know, and I
so
think
that's the problem. Man.
I think another problem too is you know, with the, you know, it's a difficult topic. I'll just say, you know, the subject that starts with a V, right? And the people taking the thing with the V.
Right.
Okay, so that particular subject, I think
Well,
that,
you said it last night. I mean, I replayed a clip of you,
yeah,
saying that it's an anti-communion. I was like, this is
it's kind
great
of like
stuff.
that. I think it is like that. I think that, you know, like it feels as if that it's in that direction, doesn't it? You know what I mean? Like you know,
Right. Yeah. Like they're trying to invert this.
yeah, exactly. Because it is ritualistic in a lot of ways. But I look at abortion a lot like that too, because you know the whole,
Well, it might be related because I heard something about them putting like using the dead stem
yeah,
cells from the babies,
exactly,
for this
exactly. Which I
concoction.
feel like that's a blasphemous act, right? And
Right. Like from the eyes or something. But yeah.
this is kind of something I was reading about. It was like, you know, the whole movement behind the people that get abortions. They say, you know, this is my body. This is the, you know, I can do what I want with my body. Well, it's an inversion of what Christ says at the, you know, when he breaks the Eucharist. This is my body. I break it for you. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's like the person backing abortion. The woman is saying, "This is my body. I do what I want." Whereas Christ is breaking his body for you. He's giving his body for you. He's doing this. So it is an inversion of, you know, the Eucharist in that sense.
Yeah, but
You know?
you got to ask yourself, where did they get a bunch of mRNA? Was it just lying around, or did it come
Right,
from the dead
exactly.
baby?
It comes from you know, and that's talked about. It's like, and why do they do something like that, right? Like put like fetal something in something like that. And I think it's like to, like we're talking about, it's to get you associated with the blasphemy. It's to mark you in some way spiritually. It's to you know, separate you from God, because that, you know, it's willingly accepting, you know, I don't know, something that's going against God and truth, and playing with it's a cult like, really. I think they know that, right? That you know, when you have the majority of people that think in atheistic ways, that's not a big deal. They don't think in spiritual terms. They don't think of the spiritual consequences. And you know, well, we got a bad leader. Well, it's because people get the leader they deserve. Well, I'm gonna end this stream. I appreciate everybody that came out. I appreciate you, Machine.
Yeah, for sure, brother.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, we'll do it up next time. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I enjoyed it. It was cool. Thank you
Yeah,
guys.
for sure, man. It's always a pleasure talking to you, man.
Always,
Yeah.
man. Later,
Yeah,
brother.
bless 'em.
Yeah.
Yeah, blessings, man.
Yeah.